Hey guys, tonight we're starting something a little eerie, a little elegant, and a lot uncomfortable. Before we begin, take a second to dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle yourself in. The marble is cool underfoot, the kind of chill that rises through your sandals and reminds you dawn has not warmed the stones yet. Rome wakes early. Bakers' crack ovens open like miniature volcanoes, their soot rising past tiled roofs. Public slaves sweep last night's dust from the forum, pushing it into neat, obedient piles. A senator's litter glides by, carried on human shoulders, its curtains whispering secrets of power. In the distance, beyond the markets and the baths and the bronze clatter of workshops, the aqueducts stride across the hills, stone colossi bringing water to a million mouths. If you look closely, you'll notice a pattern. Hands everywhere that do not belong to themselves. The boy holding the wax tablets at the lawyer's elbow. The woman inside the domus, hair-pinned, eyes lowered, pouring watered wine. The men at the baths, collecting towels, emptying chamber pots, hauling amphorae, counting olives, copying speeches, sharpening the stylus that will sign another deed to another estate. This is a city of owners and of owned. Marble and mortar, law and language, all laid atop a quiet foundation of bodies bending to commands. Now breathe in a different morning. The heat here is not stone cold, it's wet and it clings. Dew on cotton leaves becomes 1,000 pearls that cut the hands that pick them. The sun has only just cracked open the sky, and already the overseer rides the field's edge with a coiled lash like a question mark he intends to answer. The cabin doors open and a line of people carries itself to the rows. The rhythm learned, the backs already remembering yesterday's ache. There is no marble here, only dirt caked on the hems of dresses, mud sucked at by bare feet, and the white squares of cloth sacks filling with a future that does not belong to the hands that harvest it. In the big house, windows breathe in the smell of coffee and bacon. A clock ticks on the mantel. A child in lace learns to say please and thank you without ever needing those words for the people who make her mornings possible. This too is a city of owners, though the map calls it a plantation. It has its own avenues, rows of cotton straight as columns, its own senate, the men at the table counting bales and futures, its own aqueducts, the river barges that carry away profit and return with more iron and more cloth and sometimes more people. 2 empires, 2 chains. Rome will tell you that slavery is an old fact, like gravity, like the Tiber flowing downhill. A man might be born free in one city and wake up enslaved in another, wrong side of a conquest, a debt unpaid, a judge's sentence. The Romans are practical about it. They write it into ledgers, into contracts, into the sleek Latin of the law. When the litter passes, no one points and whispers, "How shameful." They say, "How splendid," because a household staffed 7 deep at every doorway is a sign you've made it. In the city, a clever slave might read more than his owner, write more beautifully, argue better in court, and still be a thing in the eyes of the law. Transactable, taxable, transferable. The empire runs on the invisible work of the unfree. The aqueduct doesn't repair itself. The sewer doesn't unclog itself. The senator's statue doesn't shine itself. The elegance of Rome is polished by hands that do not belong to themselves. Across the ocean and centuries later, America looks at bondage and decides to make it simpler, crueler, more efficient. The rule will be written on skin. Freedom will not be a question of fortune's whims or a general's victory, but of colour, of birth. A child carried by a woman who is owned will be owned. The ledger sharpens to a point. Breeding charts, bills of sale, the calculus of human bodies as interest-bearing capital. If Rome embeds slavery everywhere like threads in a tapestry, America pulls one thread taut and ropes a whole nation to it. Cotton will rise like a god, and a god demands sacrifice. Listen to the sounds. In In Rome, a teacher dictates Xenophon to a boy whose family crest is older than any of the city's cobbles. The teacher is enslaved and calls the boy Dominus. Metal rings in the smith's shop as apprentices, some free, some not, hammer out links for another chain that will be used on a farm 2 days' journey away. In the baths, laughter claps off mosaicked ceilings while a slave stands holding a tray so long his fingers tremble. In the countryside, under a beating sun not so different from any other, men in shackles turn soil for wheat and olives and grapes that will be poured gleaming into cups at banquets they will never attend. There are jokes about masters with thousands of slaves. There are elegies for masters who manumit their favourites. There are philosophers who say kindness is wise because fear makes for bad sleep. Even mercy is transactional. On the plantation, the sounds are different, sharper. The gin whines, a saw blade song, while lint hangs in the air and turns throats to paper. A hymn rises from the rows, notes braided with hope and coded maps and the names of far-off rivers. The driver calls the pace, the sack straps bite shoulders, the bell marks time in iron syllables. At night, the big house hosts guests who clap when a boy fiddler plays a tune he learned by listening through a cracked door. Laughter spills across the porch while, in the quarters, a woman stitches by candlelight, patching shirts for men who will be whipped if a seam fails. Law lives in the shadows here too, but it has a different face. It's the notice nailed to a post announcing a sale. It's the clause that says your testimony does not count. It's the price set by a man who can reduce your life to a number and not be wrong in court. If you widen the frame, you can see both systems explaining themselves. Rome says, we conquered, therefore we own. The gods favour the strong. The city needs labour. The republic, then the empire, has roads to build and walls to raise and books to copy. The language of justification is old and circular. America says, this is a new world and it requires a new kind of certainty. We will place a line and say, on this side is white and on this side is black, and we will call that line natural. We will print it in newspapers, preach it from pulpits, teach it to children, stitch it into flags, and whip it into the backs of those who disagree. The language of justification is modern and relentless, yet beneath the rhetoric there are the same human moments that no system can fully control. In Rome, a child falls asleep on the lap of a woman who will never be called mother in any legal sense but hums the lullaby anyway. A young scribe, owned by a vain man, copies letters all day and at night writes one of his own and hides it in a crack in a wall just to feel a breath of himself. A cook in a wealthy household experiments with honey and pepper and garum and smiles when the recipe sings, his creation, his secret, though it will be served under another man's name. On the plantation, a father teaches his son to weave a basket that will last longer than a season's grief. A girl learns to read from a page torn out of an almanac and folded into her shoe. Two men repair each other's backs with salves they trade like contraband tenderness. Survival invents its own grammar. The economies they build are monuments made of flesh. Rome's is diverse and omnivorous. Mines that chew up men and spit out silver. Estates that roll across hills like green ships. City workshops where every craft has its back room of bodies. The ownership can be flamboyant, a parade of attendants and porters and stylists, or it can be quiet, the clerk in the corner whose excellent penmanship is the hinge of a fortune. America's is monocular and tunnel-visioned. Cotton, rice, sugar, tobacco, the crops that drink hours and daylight. The wealth pools in a few houses and then in banks and then in ships and then in mills across an ocean. The chain is not only iron but credit, insurance, futures. Both systems teach their citizens what to admire. Rome admires a household so well staffed it never touches its own doors. America admires a field so well picked it looks like a lake of snow by noon. Fear rules both worlds, differently flavoured. In Rome, fear whispers from the memory of Spartacus and other names less famous but no less sharp. Keep them close but not too close. Don't arm them. Don't put them in uniforms that let them count their numbers. Be generous sometimes. It's cheaper than sleeping with one eye open. In America, fear is louder and more rigid. It writes itself into patrols, pass systems, curfews, codes, militias, the architecture of panic. It doesn't trust mercy. Mercy looks like weakness. It builds spectacle out of punishment because spectacle is a language even children understand. All the while, the chains evolve different mythologies. Rome dreams of the faithful household slave, the wise freedman, the magnanimous master who manumits on his birthday, who grants a peculium like a father giving a son his first purse. It also dreams the nightmare of the poisoner in the kitchen, the blade in the bathhouse, the fire in the night. America dreams of the loyal servant who knows his place, a story told over and over to make the storyteller comfortable, and it dreams its terrors, the insurrection in the dark, the plantation in flames, the justice that knocks like thunder. Both empires tell stories to themselves to survive what they're doing. Stories sand the edges. Stories excuse. Stories warn. If you walk back to Rome's Forum at noon, the heat has come and the stones glow. A magistrate speaks from the rostra, voice booming, and for a moment it's easy to believe this city is what he says it is, a community of citizens, laws, order, dignity. But the speech ends and a boy appears at his elbow, ink-stained, quick, silent, and hands him a scroll. If you return to the plantation at noon, the field shimmers and the white cotton sings in insect hum. A man straightens to stretch his back, and an overseer's voice lands on him like a hand. Somewhere, a house clock strikes 12. Somewhere, a body counts the hours without a clock. 2 empires, 2 chains. The marble teaches one lesson, the cotton another, but the underlying curriculum is the same. When you reduce people to tools, you can build great things very quickly, and you can lose yourself even faster. Rome will carve its laws into bronze and its victories into arches, and America will weave its profits into flags and its ideals into paper, and both will claim to be exceptional. Perhaps they are. Perhaps the most exceptional thing a society can do is convince itself that cruelty is inevitable and then make it orderly enough to forget. But you don't have to stand in either place very long to hear what the built world won't say out loud. In the splash of bath water and the rustle of cotton, you can hear it, simple as breathing. Someone is carrying someone else. Someone is bending. Someone is being bent. And that is how the day begins. In marble and in cotton, 2 mornings far apart, united by the weight of a work no one should ever have been born to do. Step into Rome on an ordinary morning, and it takes only a few moments before you notice the rhythm. The patter of sandals against stone, the smell of baking bread, the clatter of carts, the distant murmur of men in togas discussing law and politics. But woven into every corner of this soundscape is something quieter, less glamorous, and yet absolutely essential. The city would not function without it. The aqueducts that carry water from the mountains, the sewers that flush the filth away, the markets brimming with food, the baths humming with voices, the villas echoing with laughter. None of these marvels exist without a vast underclass of people who have no say in their labour. Slavery in Rome is not a hidden shame or a whispered secret. It is the backbone of the city, so normal and so omnipresent that to question it would be like questioning why the sun rises in the morning. Unlike later societies that dressed slavery in euphemisms or tucked it behind plantation walls, the Romans wore it in public. To walk the streets of Rome was to be surrounded by the enslaved. A senator's procession would glide past, carried by slaves on their shoulders, their faces blank, their bodies strong enough to sustain the weight of both litter and pride. In the forum, clerks copied speeches word for word, their pens scratching on wax tablets, their masters basking in eloquence that was often produced by another man's hand. In the markets, slaves stood at stalls selling fish or pouring wine, their profits pocketed not by themselves, but by the citizen who owned them. They were the hands that baked the bread, the feet that fetched the water, the voices that recited the poetry. Rome, for all its grandeur, was a machine run on bodies that did not belong to themselves. Slaves were not just numerous, they were everywhere. In the countryside, great estates known as latifundia sprawled across hillsides, feeding the empire's appetite. These estates were often staffed with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of enslaved workers who planted, harvested, and pressed olives into oil, grapes into wine, wheat into bread. The landowners might never set foot in the fields themselves, preferring to spend their days in Rome, but their wealth depended entirely on the men and women bent double in the sun, harvesting food they would never taste. Many of these rural slaves lived in chains, locked at night in barracks, their days measured by the overseer's whip. Their lives were short, brutal, and anonymous, yet without them, Rome's great banquets would have been barren. Inside the city walls, slavery looked different but was no less fundamental. Household slaves tended every aspect of a Roman home. A wealthy citizen might rise in the morning to find his sandals placed by the bed, his tunic laid out, his bath prepared. As he ate, a slave poured wine, another sliced meat, another fanned away flies. At dinner parties, guests reclined on couches, while slaves served course after course, music played by enslaved flutists, jokes whispered by enslaved jesters. For the wealthy, the presence of dozens of slaves was more than convenience. It was status. To own many slaves was to declare your power and prestige as loudly as the marble columns of your villa. The Romans collected human beings as one might collect jewels or artworks. The more you owned, the higher you stood in society's gaze. Yet slavery in Rome was not confined to drudgery. It reached into skilled and intellectual realms as well. Some of the most educated men in the city were enslaved Greeks, captured in wars or purchased for their talents. These men taught the children of Rome, guided their masters in philosophy, kept accounts with meticulous precision, or composed elegant verse that their owners then recited as if it were their own. A Roman master might be illiterate, yet own a slave who could quote Homer from memory. Paradoxically, the master still had the power to sell that same slave at auction, to beat him for a misspelled word, or to dispose of him as casually as a broken tool. Education did not shield a man from the fact that he was still, in the eyes of the law, property. Rome's infrastructure itself was maintained by slaves. The aqueducts, those soaring channels of stone that carried fresh water into the city, relied on hundreds of enslaved laborers to keep them clear and functioning. The sewer system, essential to the city's survival, was staffed by public slaves who waded into filth so that senators could debate in clean forums. Imagine the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great drain, a vast cavernous tunnel moving the waste of 1 million people. Few Romans would ever think of who kept it flowing, yet slaves labored in darkness, ankle-deep in human waste, pushing the tide of filth away so the city could continue to shine. Without them, Rome would have drowned in its own refuse. Even Rome's leisure was built on slavery. The Colosseum, that grand theatre of blood, was filled with the bodies of enslaved gladiators, men forced to fight wild animals or each other for the entertainment of citizens. The laughter, the cheers, the roars of the crowd all relied on someone's suffering. In the baths, slaves stoked the fires that heated the water, scrubbed the tiles, and carried towels for sweaty patrons. When Romans relaxed, they did so on the shoulders of those who had no right to rest. What made a normality. There was no moral panic about it, no abolitionist movement whispering in the wings. To a Roman citizen, slavery was as natural as marriage or property ownership. It was built into religion. Slaves might attend temples, but their prayers for freedom were private, unheard in the official rituals. It was built into politics. Laws defined slaves as things, not persons, their status closer to livestock than to citizens. It was built into economics. Slaves were investments, assets to be managed, speculated upon, or squandered. The idea that slavery might be wrong was almost inconceivable, even among the enslaved themselves, many of whom came from cultures that also practiced forms of servitude. Still, the veneer of acceptance did not erase the fear beneath. Masters knew that they lived surrounded by people who might resent them, people who had every reason to wish them harm. Roman history is punctuated by revolts, most famously Spartacus, but also countless smaller uprisings and plots discovered before they could blossom. This fear influenced how masters treated their slaves. Philosophers like Seneca advised moderation, not out of kindness, but out of prudence. A slave beaten too cruelly might one day slip poison into a cup or strike in the night. Mercy was often just another strategy of control. For the slaves themselves, life was a lottery determined by chance and circumstance. A child captured in war might be sold into a household where he became a beloved tutor, eventually manumitted and allowed to rise in society. Another might be sent to the mines where life expectancy was measured in months. One woman might spend her life cooking in a patrician's kitchen, developing skills that earned her a place of relative comfort. Another might be forced into prostitution, her body sold night after night for her master's profit. The diversity of slave experiences was vast, but the common thread was powerlessness. No matter how skilled, beloved, or indispensable, a slave had no legal self. And yet Rome could not exist without them. Remove slavery from the equation and the aqueducts crumble. The sewers overflow, the markets stall, the baths go cold, the banquets are silent. The empire's grandeur, so admired in marble and bronze, so admired in histories and epics, was built on the bent backs of millions whose names have been lost. Rome's roads stretch to the horizon, its laws echo in modern codes, its architecture inspires awe 2,000 years later. But beneath it all lies the quiet truth of human bondage. To live in Rome was to live in a society where slavery was not hidden behind hedges or tucked away in remote plantations. It was everywhere, as ordinary as the air. A man stepping into a bathhouse did not think twice about the slave pouring oil on his shoulders. A woman shopping in the market did not question the status of the hand that weighed her fruit. A child learning to read might not even realize that the man teaching him was not free. Rome's citizens moved through a world where ownership of human beings was a given, and where the enslaved outnumbered free men in certain regions. Slavery was Rome's bloodstream, invisible to those who benefited, life-defining to those who endured it. The marble shines only because unseen hands polished it. The grain fills the granaries only because unseen bodies harvested it. The empire rises and its shadow falls across millions who lived and died in chains, not as an aberration, not as a scandal, but as the very foundation of Roman daily life. This was not hidden. This was not taboo. This was Rome. The story of slavery in America does not begin in the fields of Virginia or the swamps of Louisiana, but on the decks of ships and in the dim spaces below them. Shackled, starved, and stacked like cargo, human beings were carried across the Atlantic in a trade that would redraw the map of the world. Out of 12.5 million Africans transported through the Middle Passage, nearly 2 million perished before ever stepping onto American soil. Those who survived staggered into a new world that would make their bodies the backbone of its wealth. Unlike the many systems of slavery that came before, America's version hardened into something distinct, something the world had not seen at such scale. It became a system defined by race, perfected for profit, and designed to last not for years or decades but for lifetimes. From its earliest days, American slavery was shaped by the hunger for labor. The soil of Virginia was rich, and tobacco proved a lucrative crop, but it demanded bodies in endless supply. At first, many of these bodies were white, poor Europeans bound by contracts of indenture. They came willingly in some cases, tricked or coerced in others, traded as punishment or simply kidnapped from city streets. They were promised freedom after years of toil, though few survived to see it. Yet the system remained unstable. Too many escaped, too many demanded land once their contracts ended, too many still belonged to the same skin color as the masters. Out of this instability came a turning point. Laws shifted in the mid-1600s, and the defining feature of bondage became not a contract or a conquest, but skin. Blackness itself became the sentence. From then on, the child of an enslaved woman was destined for slavery at birth, a legal condition that stretched from womb to grave. This racialization gave American slavery its peculiar character. Rome could enslave anyone: a Greek tutor, a Gallic farmer, a Syrian scribe, even another Italian crushed by debt. In America, slavery was narrowed into a sharp instrument. It singled out Africans and their descendants, turning the color of skin into a permanent badge of bondage. A white child and a black child could be born side by side in the same colony, but one might dream of land and liberty, while the other inherited chains before even learning to walk. The power of this racial logic was that it not only enslaved millions but also trained generations of whites, rich and poor, to believe their freedom depended on the subjugation of their black neighbors. The economics of the system drove its cruelty to new heights. In Rome, a slave was valuable but often expendable, a tool to be worked until replaced. In America, slavery was calibrated into the heart of capitalism itself. A slave was not only a worker but also a financial instrument, collateral for loans, a line item in ledgers, an appreciating asset. Cotton, rice, tobacco, and sugar made fortunes, but the true wealth was in the people forced to produce them. By the mid-1800s, the combined value of enslaved people exceeded that of all the railroads and factories in the nation. To own slaves was to sit on a pile of capital that could be mortgaged, traded, inherited, divided in wills, seized for debts, and counted in national wealth. The plantation was not just a farm, it was a business empire, and the enslaved were its stock. Because the system was so profitable, it was designed to be lifelong. Contracts could not end. Hope could not outlast a generation. If a woman bore children, those children were automatically enslaved, expanding the labor force at no cost to the master. This was slavery as a perpetual engine, one that generated not just cotton, but people. An intergenerational captivity that locked entire bloodlines into bondage. A man could toil until death, and still his son, his grandson, his great-grandson would be forced into the same fields. The future itself was shackled. Daily life under this system was built on violence. Whips cracked not just as punishment, but as management. The overseer's lash dictating the pace of work like a metronome. Branding irons, collars, chains, and mutilation were all tools of discipline. Families were broken on the auction block, a child crying as her mother was sold to another county, a father begging as his son was carried off by a trader. These sales were not accidents but part of the system's design. Slavery was profitable in motion. Traders marched chained coffles of men across the south, buying low in one region, selling high in another, each step of the journey squeezing profit from despair. Advertisements for runaways filled newspapers, descriptions of scars and missing toes, each mark a ledger of past punishments. What made America's version unique was how deeply it was justified and normalized. In Rome, slavery was a fact of conquest, rarely moralized, rarely denied. In America, it was justified with an entire ideology. Ministers preached that Africans were cursed in Scripture. Scientists wrote false studies to claim biological inferiority. Politicians thundered that slavery was a positive good, not a necessary evil, but a blessing for the enslaved themselves. Writers, teachers, and even children's books repeated the mantra until it became common sense for generations. This ideological armor made American slavery more rigid, less flexible than systems before it. To challenge it was to challenge the very order of society, race, and God himself, as defenders claimed. The politics of the nation bled with this contradiction. The Constitution, that shining document of liberty, contained hidden protections for slavery: the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the 20-year extension of the transatlantic trade. America's identity as a free republic was built on the unpaid labor of millions who had no vote, no voice, no rights. Senators dueled with canes and fists over the question, laws bent and broke under its weight, and still the institution expanded, spreading westward with every new territory. Cotton drove it further, each bale feeding northern mills and British factories, tying the prosperity of two continents to the suffering of the enslaved. Yet despite its power, resistance never ceased. Enslaved people ran away, some vanishing into forests, others making perilous journeys north to freedom. Songs carried hidden maps, spirituals layered with instructions on how to move, when to leave, where to hide. Some rebelled openly, like Nat Turner, whose uprising shook Virginia with fear. Most resisted quietly, breaking tools, feigning illness, slowing the pace of work, preserving fragments of culture and dignity in the face of relentless oppression. Resistance was woven into daily survival, a refusal to surrender completely even when the law declared you property. The system endured because it divided as much as it enslaved. Poor whites, themselves often destitute, were given just enough privilege to feel superior. They could own no land, starve in cabins, and still believe they were above the enslaved because of their color. This was the genius of the ruling class. By racializing slavery, they prevented solidarity between the oppressed, ensuring the underclass would never unite against the elite. The tactic of divide and conquer that once kept Roman masters safe now hardened into America's deepest wound, shaping social hierarchies long after slavery's legal end. When the Civil War finally came, it was not only a battle over union or independence, but over the core of the American system. 4 million enslaved people represented both the wealth of the South and the moral contradiction of the nation. The war consumed lives and land, and when the 13th Amendment at last abolished slavery in 1865, the chains were cut, but the scars remained. Freed people were left with nothing but freedom itself. No land, no compensation, no protection against laws designed to keep them at the bottom. Black codes, convict leasing, lynch mobs, and Jim Crow emerged as new forms of control, proof that the peculiar institution had not ended so much as it had evolved. What makes American slavery stand apart in history is not only its brutality but its design. It was a system honed for maximum profit, built to last across generations, and justified by a full-blown ideology of race. It was not incidental to the American story but central to it, shaping its economy, its politics, its culture, and its divisions. Where Rome saw slavery as one part of empire, America made it the foundation of its rise. The marble of Rome gleamed because unseen hands polished it. The wealth of America grew because unseen hands picked, planted, and bled into the soil. Both empires built greatness on bondage, but America's peculiar institution bound itself into the very definition of freedom, creating a nation that preached liberty while profiting from chains. And even slavery seeded fortunes that lasted for centuries. The racial hierarchy created to defend it endured in law, in custom, in prejudice. To understand America's peculiar institution is to understand how bondage became not just a condition of labor, but a condition of life, passed down like inheritance, shaping not only those who were enslaved, but the very soul of the country that enslaved them. It was more than a system of work. It was a system of being, and its shadow stretches forward still. Numbers have a way of making suffering abstract, reducing lives to figures that can be neatly recited. Yet in the case of slavery, the numbers themselves stagger the imagination, so large and so heavy that even when stripped of names and stories, they still press down like stone. To compare the scale of Roman slavery with that of American slavery is to place two vast worlds of bondage side by side, each distinct, each horrific, and each revealing something about how societies measure power in human flesh. At the height of the Roman Empire, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population was enslaved. Estimates vary, but most historians settle between 5 and 12 million people living in chains at any given time. Imagine walking through Rome where 1 out of every 5 faces you saw belonged to someone who did not belong to themselves. In certain regions of Italy, particularly around the wealthy estates that sprawled across fertile land, slaves may have outnumbered the free 2 or even 3 to 1. This was not an empire with slavery at its edges, hidden in colonies or tucked away in distant provinces. It was at the very heart of the city itself, a demographic reality that touched every level of life. America's numbers look smaller at first glance. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the United States counted roughly 4 million enslaved people. That is less than half of Rome's enslaved population at its peak. Yet the proportion tells a different story. The US population at the time was about 31 million. This means that over 10% of the entire country lived in bondage, and in the South, the figure was far higher. In states like Mississippi and South Carolina, enslaved people made up the majority. Whole regions functioned less like free societies with slaves at the margins and more like vast prisons with a free minority perched on top. Numbers take on meaning only in context. Rome's empire spanned across 3 continents, swallowing peoples from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. Its tens of millions of subjects included senators, citizens, provincials, and conquered enemies, all bound under a single imperial system. Within this sprawl, millions were enslaved, drawn from every corner of the empire. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, looked different, thought different, yet they were all absorbed into the same legal category: property. That 5 to 12 million figure becomes even more immense when you consider how scattered the empire's population was, and how crucial the enslaved were to maintaining the daily rhythm of Roman life. America, by contrast, was a young nation with a smaller population and a slavery system geographically concentrated in the South. Its enslaved population was not a diverse tapestry of conquered peoples, but overwhelmingly African and African-descended, bound together by color and lineage. The 4 million slaves of 1860 were not simply a fraction of the country's labor force. They were its most valuable economic asset, the very foundation of the Southern economy and a central pillar of national wealth. They grew the cotton that fed northern factories and British mills. They were counted in ledgers, used as collateral for loans, and divided as inheritance. 4 million people may be fewer than 12 million, but their economic weight was titanic, their forced labor responsible for much of the wealth of the United States on the eve of its bloodiest war. The staggering nature of these numbers also emerges when you consider growth. Rome's population of slaves swelled and shrank with conquest, war, and economic cycles. Victories over Greece or Gaul might flood the markets with new captives, while times of peace saw the supply slow. Slavery in Rome was dynamic, subject to the rhythms of expansion. America's slavery grew differently. It did not depend on constant conquest, but on reproduction. The transatlantic slave trade was officially closed in 1808, yet the number of enslaved people skyrocketed from about 1 million at the start of the century to 4 million by its middle. This was a system that bred itself. Enslaved women's wombs were as much a part of the machinery of profit as their hands in the fields. Families were torn apart and sold precisely because children represented new capital. The numbers rose because the system was designed to reproduce bondage generation after generation. Scale also shapes perception. In Rome, when a household owned hundreds or even thousands of slaves, this was seen as a mark of prestige. The more bodies you commanded, the more powerful you appeared. Wealthy Romans flaunted their slave numbers as conspicuously as they flaunted their villas or their jewels. In America, slaveholding was widespread but stratified. Only a quarter of white households in the South owned slaves at all, and the vast majority owned fewer than 10. The myth of the typical small slaveholder has some truth, but the wealth and political power of the South concentrated in the hands of a small elite who owned hundreds, sometimes thousands of human beings. Just 1% of the Southern population controlled more than half of all enslaved people. This numerical concentration made slavery both omnipresent and deeply unequal. For millions of whites, the aspiration to own slaves was as much a social dream as a financial one, a mark of entry into an elite class. Numbers also measure mortality. In Rome, the mines were infamous for swallowing lives. Workers in quarries or underground tunnels often lived only months, dying from exhaustion, malnutrition, or collapse. Rural slaves on latifundia faced similarly brutal odds, with average life expectancy far below that of free citizens. Replacement came from conquest. When one group perished, another war supplied new labor. In America, death was also constant, but often slower. Field hands endured 15 or 16-hour days in blistering sun, beatings, malnutrition, and disease. The difference was that in the US, masters had a financial incentive to preserve the lives of their slaves long enough to breed and work. This did not mean humane treatment. It meant a calculation between cruelty and cost. Still, death was omnipresent, whether on the voyage across the Atlantic, on the auction block, or in the relentless grind of the fields. Each number in the census concealed lives cut short, bodies broken, and families erased. The comparison reveals something else: the psychological weight of proportion. In Rome, slaves were everywhere, but they were not defined by one ethnicity. A master might own a Greek tutor, a German guard, a Syrian cook, and a North African secretary. This diversity diluted solidarity, making large-scale revolts rare and difficult to sustain. In America, solidarity was fractured differently. Skin color itself became the marker, uniting the enslaved in shared oppression but also isolating them from potential white allies. 4 million people bound by race carried a different kind of weight. A visible, undeniable presence that terrified slaveholders who feared rebellion at every whisper of unrest. The very uniformity of the enslaved population made the institution both powerful and unstable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. When you line up the figures side by side, 5 to 12 million in Rome, 4 million in America, you begin to see less a contest of scale and more a contest of intensity. Rome's numbers stagger because of their sheer magnitude across centuries of conquest and empire. America's numbers stagger because of the density of suffering in a smaller, younger nation that managed to compress so much cruelty into so few years. Both reveal societies that bent mathematics to justify their foundations. Rome spoke of percentages and property, America of census tables and capital value. Behind every digit was a man, woman, or child, whose life was measured not by name but by worth. The numbers stagger because they force us to confront the enormity of what was considered ordinary. In Rome, the sight of thousands of slaves in a triumphal parade was a spectacle, not a scandal. In America, the tally of 4 million enslaved souls in 1860 was a matter of political calculation, their presence used to balance representation in Congress to determine the distribution of power in a supposed democracy. These numbers were woven into law, into economics, into daily life until they ceased to shock the people who lived among them. And yet to us, looking back, they remain staggering. 5 million or 12 million or 4 million. The precise figure is less important than the recognition that entire civilizations balance themselves on these mountains of human bondage. The stones of Rome's aqueducts gleamed because millions carried them. The cotton bales of America gleamed because millions picked them. Each number is not an abstraction, but a silence, a life without voice, a family without freedom, a generation lost to chains. Rome and America both built empires out of arithmetic, but the sums they left behind are written in grief. To truly understand the weight of these numbers is not just to marvel at their size, but to feel the absence they represent, an absence measured not in digits but in lives that stagger the imagination. Slavery begins, always, with a story of how one person loses control of their own life. No one is born thinking they should belong to another. The condition is forced, justified, and normalized through systems that make the extraordinary seem inevitable. When we speak of the origins of enslavement in Rome and in America, we are not just talking about where the slaves came from, but about how two very different societies imagined the act of turning free human beings into property. Rome rooted its system in conquest, debt, and punishment, while America planted its in kidnapping, transatlantic commerce, and hereditary bondage. The paths diverged, but both ended at the same place. Men, women, and children stripped of choice and transformed into instruments of profit and power. In Rome, the origins of slavery lay in the rhythm of war. Conquest was the empire's heartbeat, and with every campaign came captives. Defeated soldiers, captured civilians, entire towns and villages were marched in chains behind triumphant generals. To the Romans, this was not cruelty but tradition. Victory meant spoils, and human spoils were the most valuable of all. When Rome crushed Carthage, when it swept through Greece, when it subdued Gaul, thousands upon thousands of prisoners were sold into slavery, flooding the markets with bodies. These war captives were paraded through the city in triumphs, forced to march in humiliation before being auctioned off to the highest bidder. In this way, the Roman appetite for expansion fed the appetite for slaves, and each new conquest replenished the system with fresh labor. But not all Roman slaves were prisoners of foreign wars. Some were Romans themselves, ensnared by debt. In the early Republic, a citizen unable to pay what he owed could fall into a condition called nexum, a form of debt bondage, where the debtor became the servant of his creditor until the balance was settled. This system was eventually abolished, but the precedent lingered. Financial failure could still strip a man of his freedom, and poverty remained a gateway into servitude. Others entered slavery through punishment. Criminals, rebels, or even those accused of treason could be condemned to the mines or the galleys, fates considered worse than death. These punishments were both practical and symbolic. Rome rid itself of those it considered dangerous while extracting labor from them, binding social order and economic gain together. The origins of Roman slavery, then, were tied to three ideas: the spoils of conquest, the repayment of debt, and the enforcement of law. All of them framed slavery as a consequence of failure. Failure to win, failure to pay, failure to obey. The victim was blamed for his condition, and the system could be justified as natural order. It was not about race or appearance. A man from Gaul, a woman from Greece, a child from Syria, all could become slaves. Freedom and slavery were not determined at birth, but by fortune, by circumstance, by which side of the spear or ledger you happened to be on. America's origins were different and darker in their rigidity. Slavery there did not emerge from conquest of neighboring peoples or debts unpaid. It was born of kidnapping and the commodification of African bodies on a global scale. From the 15th century onward, European traders established footholds along the coast of West Africa. They bought captives from local rulers and warlords, who often acquired them through raids or intertribal wars. Others they seized directly, snatching men, women and children from villages and loading them onto ships. These were not spoils of battlefield victories waged by Americans themselves, but transactions in a global marketplace. People became units of trade exchanged for guns, textiles and rum, part of the triangular system that linked Europe, Africa and the Americas. The Middle Passage, that horrific voyage across the Atlantic, was the crucible of American slavery. Shackled in the dark, pressed together in suffocating holds, Africans endured weeks or months of terror where disease, starvation and despair claimed countless lives. An estimated 1 in 5 perished before reaching land, their bodies thrown overboard, their names erased. For those who survived, the ordeal was only the beginning. They were unloaded like cargo, inspected like livestock, and sold into a system that intended not just to work them but to own their descendants. What made American slavery truly peculiar was the codification of hereditary bondage. In 1662, a Virginia law declared that the condition of the child followed that of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, so too was the child. This simple line of legal text hardened into a generational chain, binding not just individuals but entire bloodlines into servitude. Unlike Rome, where freedom could be regained through manumission, or where slavery might end with a master's whim, American slavery was engineered to self-replicate. A child born on a plantation carried chains from its first breath, destined to labor for a master it had never met, punished for a condition it had never chosen. This distinction matters. In Rome, an enslaved Greek philosopher might one day win his freedom, become a tutor, and rise to influence. In America, no matter how skilled, how loyal, or how educated, a black man remained a slave unless extraordinary chance intervened. His children and grandchildren were presumed property, no matter their talents or virtues. Race turned bondage into a permanent state, not just a misfortune of war or circumstance, but a birthright of degradation. Punishment, too, functioned differently in the origins of each system. In Rome, slavery could be a penalty for crimes, a sentence meant to strip dignity and extract labor as retribution. In America, punishment was not the origin, but the daily language of enforcement. Whips, chains, mutilation and terror were not just tools of discipline, but mechanisms to ensure that a kidnapped and unwilling people remained submissive generation after generation. Where Rome absorbed slaves as fallout from conquest, America sustained slavery by manufacturing submission, forging laws and customs that turned blackness itself into evidence of servitude. Economics sharpened these origins into systems of staggering endurance. Rome's slave supply rose and fell with the fortunes of war. When expansion slowed, so did the influx of captives, and the system adjusted with manumissions and shifting labor practices. America's slavery, however, did not depend on conquest abroad, but on internal reproduction and international trade. The kidnapping of Africans ensured a steady influx for centuries, and once the Atlantic trade was outlawed, the hereditary nature of bondage guaranteed its continuation. The wombs of enslaved women became factories of labor, their children automatically catalogued as assets. This meant the American system did not just survive disruptions, it thrived. By 1860, even though the transatlantic trade had been banned for over half a century, the enslaved population had quadrupled, grown from natural increase, proof that the origins of the system were designed not for temporary profit but for perpetual exploitation. Both systems reveal how societies justified the indefensible. Rome looked to conquest and said, "The strong rule the weak." Debt was sacred, so those who failed must serve. Law was supreme, so those who broke it deserved chains. America looked to race and said, "Blackness is evidence of inferiority." Kidnapping was reframed as trade, a legitimate exchange of goods. Hereditary bondage was dressed up as efficiency, a way to ensure stability and prosperity. Each origin story was a rationalization, a way to transform violence and theft into something that appeared lawful, even natural. Yet for those caught in it, the origins hardly mattered. The Greek philosopher sold after a war, the Roman debtor shackled for what he owed, the African child ripped from her village, the baby born into a Virginian cabin. Each felt the same reality, life no longer their own. The origins shaped the rules, but the end result was the same reduction of person to property. The difference was that Rome's system allowed some chance of escape, however slim, while America's welded the chains tighter, making slavery not just a condition but an inheritance. When we trace these origins, we see more than historical details. We see how different cultures can invent different doors into the same prison. Rome used conquest, debt, and punishment as its keys. America used kidnapping, trade, and bloodlines. Both believed themselves justified. Both wrote laws to sanctify theft. And both left behind legacies of suffering that cannot be reduced to numbers or statutes. They remind us that slavery never emerges by accident. It is built deliberately, justified carefully, and enforced ruthlessly. Its origins are the architecture of its cruelty, the blueprint for centuries of broken lives. Walk through the crowded Forum of Rome at its height, and you will see a swirl of faces: bronzed Italians, bearded Greeks, blonde-haired Gauls, dark-skinned Syrians, Egyptians with shaven heads, Jews from Judea, traders from Asia Minor. Some are citizens striding proudly, others are provincials seeking favor, and many are slaves, though you might not know it at first glance. In Rome, anyone could be a slave. Ethnicity offered no shield. Conquest was colorblind, and the empire's hunger for labor did not discriminate between the pale-skinned Briton and the olive-skinned Spaniard, between the scholar from Athens and the farmer from Germania. Slavery in Rome was universal in its reach, encompassing all who fell on the wrong side of war, debt, or law. Now step onto an American plantation in the 19th century. The picture changes immediately. The faces of the enslaved are overwhelmingly African or African descended. Dark skin itself has become the marker of servitude, the living badge that defines who can be owned. Unlike Rome, where the enslaved blended into the diversity of empire, America sharpened slavery into a racial institution. It was not enough to conquer or capture. Instead, bondage was inherited through blood, and skin color determined one's legal and social destiny. This distinction, universal servitude in Rome, racial servitude in America, is one of the most profound differences between the two systems, shaping how slavery was lived, justified, and remembered. Rome's world of slavery was built on expansion. Every successful campaign brought a flood of captives into the markets. A Greek city sacked by legionaries might see its philosophers and artisans chained alongside farmers and children, sold to Roman buyers who valued them for their skills or their labor. A Gallic tribe defeated in battle might find its young men forced into the mines of Spain while its women worked in Italian households. Syrians, Egyptians, Thracians, Numidians, Jews, Rome took from everywhere. The empire was a sponge, absorbing entire populations generations into its labor pool. To be enslaved was not to be marked by birth or appearance, but to be unlucky, to lose in the endless roll of Rome's military dice. This universality meant that Roman slavery produced extraordinary diversity. Within a single household, you might find a Greek tutor teaching literature to the children, a Germanic bodyguard standing at the door, a Gallic cook sweating in the kitchen, a Syrian concubine in the master's bed, and an Italian peasant reduced to servitude through debt. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and carried different histories, yet in Rome all shared the same status: property. A passerby could not always tell master from slave by appearance alone. A blonde-haired woman in chains might once have been free in a northern village. A man with sharp features quoting Aristotle might be enslaved even as he outshone his master intellectually. Rome's system blurred lines, folding the conquered into the fabric of empire until servitude was simply another thread in the pattern. America took the opposite path. By the 17th century, laws in Virginia and Maryland made slavery hereditary and racial. The child of an enslaved woman would also be enslaved regardless of the father's status. Blackness itself became the defining trait of bondage. Poor whites, even if indentured or imprisoned, could expect eventual freedom, while Africans and their descendants were bound for life. Over time, laws hardened these distinctions further, forbidding interracial marriage, punishing relationships across racial lines, and branding Africans as an inferior class by nature. A single glance at skin color became sufficient to determine whether a person belonged in chains. This racialization gave American slavery its peculiar cruelty. It was no longer possible to escape one's condition by education, loyalty, or talent. A black child born in the United States entered the world already enslaved, the mark of servitude written on the body itself. No victory in battle had brought that child into bondage. No debt unpaid, no crime committed. The origin was simply blood, and the justification was the fiction of race. This turned slavery from a condition of misfortune into a permanent caste system, dividing society along visible lines that outlived slavery itself. In Rome, a slave could sometimes blend into the free poor. They wore similar clothes, lived in similar neighborhoods, and often shared the same struggles. The Senate once debated giving slaves a distinctive uniform, but abandoned the idea out of fear that the enslaved would recognize how many they were. In America, no such blending was possible. Blackness was itself the uniform. It made solidarity across racial lines more difficult, ensured that even free blacks were treated with suspicion, and gave poor whites a fragile sense of superiority that elites exploited to keep rebellion at bay. Race made slavery both more rigid and more isolating. Yet Rome's universality carried its own brutal logic. Because anyone could be enslaved, even Romans lived with the knowledge that their fate could change. A free farmer, ruined by debt, might end up in chains. A citizen captured in war might find himself laboring in the provinces. The fluidity of status gave slavery a ubiquity that made it seem natural, unavoidable, part of the cycle of fortune. Masters and slaves might share similar features, similar languages, even similar ancestors. This proximity blurred moral boundaries, making it easier for Romans to accept the practice as an ordinary fact of life. America's rigidity created a different kind of acceptance. By confining slavery to Africans and their descendants, white Americans could imagine themselves immune, protected by color. This produced a psychological distance that made the system easier to rationalize. Slavery was no longer an accident of fate, but a natural order, with whites free and blacks enslaved. The universality of Roman slavery made it common but not racial. The racialization of American slavery made it permanent and deeply entwined with identity. Both systems stripped people of freedom, but they did so in ways that shaped the societies around them in profoundly different ways. The difference is also visible in the possibility of freedom. In Rome, manumission was common enough that freedmen formed a substantial class. A slave could save peculium, earn his freedom, and sometimes rise to wealth and prominence. His children might even become citizens, erasing the stigma within a generation. In America, manumission was far rarer and often resisted by law. Freed blacks remained marked by their race, excluded from full participation, and vulnerable to re-enslavement or violent discrimination. Even freedom did not erase the stigma. Rome's slaves could sometimes cross into citizenship, while America's slaves and their descendants were confined by color long after emancipation. Who could be a slave? In Rome, the answer was anyone unlucky enough to be conquered, indebted, or condemned. Slavery was a matter of circumstance, and its victims reflected the empire's diversity. In America, the answer was overwhelmingly Africans and their children. Slavery was a matter of race, and its victims reflected the narrowing of freedom into a white privilege guarded by law, violence, and ideology. Both systems produced staggering suffering, but the difference in who could be enslaved shaped not only the lives of the enslaved, but the very foundations of the societies that enslaved them. To walk through Rome was to see slavery everywhere, woven into the diversity of empire. To walk through America was to see slavery concentrated in blackness, a singular focus that made race the dividing line of the nation. In both cases, the answer to who could be a slave revealed not just the cruelty of the system, but the logic of the civilization itself. Rome's empire thrived on conquest, so slavery absorbed the conquered. America's empire thrived on racial capitalism, so slavery absorbed blackness. In the end, the result was the same: millions of lives reduced to property. But the way each society defined who could be enslaved would echo far beyond their lifetimes. Rome leaving a legacy of slavery as ordinary fortune, America leaving a legacy of slavery as racial destiny, one that still reverberates today. The hum of the city and the silence of the fields tell two very different stories about slavery. To walk the streets of Rome was to see slavery everywhere, woven into the very texture of urban life, yet often without chains, without the obvious signs that marked people as property. To walk through the cotton fields of the American South was to encounter slavery in its rawest form: rows of bent backs under the sun, overseers on horseback, the lash carried like a shadow across the day. Urban Rome and plantation America each reveal how the same institution, ownership of human beings, could look so different depending on geography, economy, and ideology, and how those differences shaped the lives of millions. In Rome, the city was a machine and slaves were its gears. Markets thrived with their labor, public works were maintained by their hands, and households relied on their constant presence. In the bustling forum, slaves carried messages, kept accounts, and polished the bronze of statues until they gleamed. In workshops tucked into alleys, they wove cloth, forged tools, and baked bread. A wealthy Roman might employ dozens of slaves inside his domus alone: porters at the gate, scribes in the study, cooks in the kitchen, nurses tending children, attendants grooming their master before he stepped out into public life. Many of these urban slaves lived in close proximity to their owners, and while this did not erase their bondage, it gave their servitude a different texture. They often spoke the same language, shared meals at the edges of banquets, and sometimes even managed their master's business affairs. But the city was not all comfort for slaves. Many were tasked with the dirtiest jobs imaginable. Public slaves managed the aqueducts and the sewers, spending long hours clearing blockages from channels of waste or climbing precarious scaffolding to repair stone arches. Rome's famous communal latrines, where citizens sat side by side, existed only because enslaved men hauled the filth away at night. Others toiled in mines or quarries at the empire's edge, sentenced to a slow death beneath the earth. These workers were invisible to the city itself, but they made its splendor possible, extracting the silver for coins, the marble for temples, the iron for weapons. Urban life could mean proximity to privilege, but it could just as easily mean anonymity in labor that consumed bodies until nothing was left. The visibility of Roman slavery in the city created a paradox. On one hand, slaves blended in with the free poor, often indistinguishable in clothing or manner. On the other hand, they were everywhere, so common that to question their presence would have seemed absurd. The philosopher Seneca could advise humane treatment of slaves not because he believed in equality, but because the master lived surrounded by them, dependent on their goodwill to avoid a knife in the night. In the urban environment, slavery was normalized not by hiding it, but by making it an inseparable part of the civic landscape. In America, the plantation was not a city, but a kingdom, isolated and self-sufficient, ruled by a master whose wealth and status were measured in acres and bodies. Here, slavery did not blend into daily bustle. It dominated every inch of life. The most common sight was the field gang. Rows of men, women, and children bent over cotton, tobacco, or sugar, working from first light until sundown. Overseers rode along the lines, whips at their sides, calling the pace, punishing any sign of lagging. Work was collective and grueling, measured by the acre and enforced by terror. Unlike Rome, where some slaves could specialize in skilled or domestic roles, the plantation field hands had little opportunity for differentiation. Their days were dictated by the rhythms of the crop, season after season, year after year, with little variation and no reprieve. The specific crops shaped the severity of the labor. Cotton required endless hours of picking, each boll tearing at fingers until they bled. Tobacco demanded careful tending, with toxic sap staining skin and clothing. Sugar was perhaps the harshest of all, its harvest requiring back-breaking cutting in sweltering heat, followed by dangerous work in boiling houses where enslaved laborers risked burns, mutilation, and death. The plantation was not a place of variety but of monotony and exhaustion, designed to wring maximum profit from the bodies of those forced to work. Unlike in Rome, plantation slavery was not woven into the daily fabric of cities, but concentrated in rural expanses where one man's power extended over hundreds of acres and dozens or hundreds of enslaved people. This concentration created a world of constant surveillance. Field hands were monitored by overseers. Domestic slaves were monitored inside the master's house. Movement was restricted by passes and patrols, and the threat of violence hung over everything. While Roman slaves in cities might slip unnoticed among the crowds or save for manumission, American slaves in plantations lived under a system that made escape difficult and freedom nearly impossible. The differences extended to social interaction. In urban Rome, slaves often lived side by side with their owners, sometimes even sleeping in adjoining quarters. They were witnesses to their master's private life, confidants, attendants, and in some cases, collaborators in business. This intimacy created strange dynamics. Loyalty mixed with resentment, affection mingled with exploitation. Freed slaves could continue to serve their former masters as clients, maintaining bonds that blurred the line between family and servitude. In the American plantation, intimacy took a darker turn. Domestic slaves lived inside the master's household, but this proximity often meant vulnerability to sexual exploitation and abuse. Field hands, meanwhile, rarely interacted with the master directly, their lives governed instead by overseers who wielded power with brutality and little accountability. Freedom, too, looked different across the two systems. In Rome's urban world, a skilled slave might accumulate a peculium, a personal fund allowed by the master, and one day purchase freedom. Manumission was common enough that freedmen formed a visible social class, sometimes rising to wealth and influence. Their children, born free, could aspire to citizenship. plantation America, freedom was a rarity. Even if manumission occurred, the laws and customs of race meant that a freed black person remained marginalized, subject to suspicion, hostility, and discriminatory laws. The plantation was designed not to produce freedmen, but to perpetuate slavery, generation after generation, binding not just individuals but families and entire communities to the land. The role of fear cannot be overstated. In Rome, masters feared revolt, especially in rural estates where slaves outnumbered free men. The memory of Spartacus haunted them, and laws were passed to discourage large gatherings of slaves or to punish runaways harshly. Yet in the city, the close relationship between master and slave sometimes tempered cruelty, if only out of self-preservation. In America, fear was institutionalized into law and violence. Patrols hunted runaways, slave codes prescribed brutal punishments for even minor resistance, and rebellions were crushed with ferocity. The plantation was a fortress built on domination, where every interaction reinforced the hierarchy of race and power. The environment itself deepened the contrast. Rome's city slaves moved through markets, temples, theatres and baths, surrounded by the bustle of civic life. Their servitude was public, visible to all, and their labour shaped the daily experience of citizens. In America, the plantation was isolated, a closed system where the enslaved lived and died largely out of sight of the broader public. Their suffering was hidden behind the wealth it generated, revealed only in the cotton bales shipped north or the sugar packed into barrels. The city celebrated the visibility of slavery, while the plantation profited from its invisibility. And yet, despite the differences, both systems reveal the same truth, that civilizations build their grandeur on the backs of the unfree. The aqueducts of Rome and the cotton fields of America may look different, but each was a monument to exploitation. Rome's city shone with marble polished by slaves. America's wealth swelled with cotton picked by slaves. One system allowed diversity and proximity, the other enforced racial uniformity and isolation, but both reduced human beings to instruments of labor, denied them autonomy, and justified it as natural order. When we compare urban Rome to plantation America, we are not simply comparing geography or economics. We are comparing two visions of how slavery could be integrated into society. Rome made it ordinary, blending it into the bustle of the city until it seemed inseparable from urban life. America made it extraordinary in its cruelty, concentrating it in fields where race and labor fused into a system designed to last for centuries. Both stagger the imagination, and both remind us that the form slavery takes is always shaped by the needs of those who profit from it. Rome needed slaves to run its cities, so slavery was everywhere in public view. America needed slaves to fuel its agricultural empire, so slavery was hidden in fields yet monumental in its economic power. Different worlds, different landscapes, but the same dark truth. The city's hum and the field's silence were both built on human suffering, disguised as the ordinary rhythm of life. Not all slavery looks the same when you stand close to it. Chains and whips might be the most obvious symbols, but within both Rome and America there were worlds of difference between what a slave's day could look like. One man might spend his life bent over a cotton row, his fingers raw, his back bent under a sun that never showed mercy. Another might hold a pen in a Roman atrium, copying letters, recording accounts, and reading aloud speeches that shaped the politics of an empire. One woman might cook meals for a plantation family, always under the watchful eye of a mistress ready to punish a mistake. Another might serve in a Roman household as a midwife or nurse, tending not only children but entire families with knowledge passed down through generations. Slavery was never a single experience. It was a spectrum of labor, ranging from skilled intellectual service to the harshest manual drudgery. And nowhere is this contrast sharper than when you place Rome's skilled servants alongside America's field hands. In Rome, conquest swept in not just farmers and soldiers, but also educated men from Greece, Asia Minor, and the eastern provinces. When a city was sacked, libraries burned and temples looted, but the victors also carried off philosophers, physicians, and scribes. These men were treasures in their own right, valued not for their strength, but for their intellect. A wealthy Roman could purchase a Greek tutor to instruct his sons in rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, the cultural polish that marked elite status. Owning such a slave was a sign of refinement, proof that you had both the means to buy wisdom and the leisure to enjoy it. For the enslaved, the work could be less brutal than the mines or fields, but it carried its own ironies. A man might be learned enough to quote Homer, yet legally he was a piece of property, unable to decide his own fate. His words shaped free citizens, but his own voice was silenced in law. Doctors, too, were often slaves in Rome. The empire absorbed medical knowledge from Greece, and enslaved physicians could become central figures in a household. They treated illnesses, performed surgeries, and delivered children. Some gained renown for their skills, managing not just their master's health, but that of clients, neighbors, even entire communities. Their position could grant them respect, sometimes even a pathway to manumission. Yet, however respected, they were still at the mercy of their master. A cure gone wrong, a diagnosis that failed, and their status as property could erase any reputation. The paradox was stark. The same hand that saved a master's life could be punished like any tool that failed to perform. Scribes and secretaries formed another class of skilled slaves in Rome. They copied documents, managed correspondence, and kept financial accounts. In a society built on rhetoric, law, and administration, these tasks were vital. Many masters lacked the literacy of their slaves, relying on them to write letters and speeches. This gave enslaved scribes a certain power, a chance to shape words that would echo in courts and assemblies. Some developed close relationships with their masters, trusted with secrets, finances, and political strategies. Others used their skills to accumulate peculium, the small savings that might one day purchase freedom. But trust was always precarious. A scribe could rise to influence one moment and be sold the next, his fate determined not by his talent but by the whims of ownership. In America, slavery produced very different patterns of labor. The overwhelming majority of the enslaved worked not as teachers or doctors, but as agricultural laborers in the fields. Cotton was king by the 19th century, and cotton demanded endless back-breaking effort. Day after day, men, women, and even children walked the rows, picking bowls, dragging heavy sacks across their shoulders, their fingers torn by thorns. From sun-up to sundown, their labor was dictated by the crop, overseen by the ever-present threat of violence. Tobacco and rice had their own demands, requiring careful planting, tending, and harvesting under brutal conditions. Sugar plantations, particularly in Louisiana and the Caribbean, were infamous for their cruelty, where the combination of heat, physical strain, and the hazards of sugar processing shortened lives dramatically. The system of field gangs stripped individuality from labor. Unlike Rome, where a skilled slave might work in a household with relative autonomy, American field hands were organized into lines, their movements synchronized under the orders of a driver or overseer. Work was collective, punishment often public. The lash cracked not only to correct, but to set a rhythm, ensuring that bodies moved in unison with maximum efficiency. This system was designed to crush resistance and extract the highest yield from human labor. The field was not a place for individuality or skill to shine. It was a place where human beings were turned into tools, their worth measured by how much cotton or sugar they could produce in a day. There were, of course, enslaved people in America who worked in domestic service. Inside the master's house, they cooked, cleaned, laundered clothes, tended children, and sometimes acted as personal attendants. These roles could bring proximity to privilege, even a degree of trust or responsibility, but they carried their own dangers. Domestic slaves lived under constant scrutiny, with no escape from the demands of their owners. Mistakes could invite harsh punishment. Women in these positions were especially vulnerable to sexual abuse, trapped in households where power was absolute and unchecked. The work might have been less physically grueling than the fields, but it was saturated with humiliation, surveillance, and exploitation. The contrast between Rome's skilled servants and America's field hands highlights not just differences in labor, but differences in how each society imagined slavery. Rome saw slaves as resources to be used according to their talents. A man with knowledge of medicine, literature, or numbers could be purchased for a high price and put to work in ways that showcased his skill. A slave might be a janitor or a philosopher depending on his background, and while both were considered property, their daily lives looked radically different. America, by contrast, defined slavery through race and profit. The overwhelming need was for labor in the fields, and so black bodies were forced into agricultural toil regardless of individual talents. A man might be strong, clever, or skilled, but the system saw him first as a field hand. There were exceptions: blacksmiths, carpenters, and drivers who supervised gangs, but the majority were bound to the soil, their individuality erased in rows of cotton and tobacco. Education sharpened this divide. In Rome, a slave might be more educated than his master, and this paradox was tolerated, even valued, so long as it served the master's prestige. In America, teaching slaves to read or write was often outlawed. Literate slaves were seen as dangerous, potential leaders of rebellion, able to communicate and organize. Knowledge was withheld as a weapon of control. Where Rome could celebrate an educated slave as a symbol of refinement, America feared him as a threat. The denial of literacy was not just about limiting opportunity, it was about ensuring ignorance, maintaining a system where control required darkness. Freedom, too, was shaped by the type of labor performed. In Rome, skilled slaves had a higher chance of manumission. A trusted doctor, tutor, or scribe might be rewarded with freedom, and once free could sometimes accumulate wealth, property, even political influence. The children of freedmen could become citizens, erasing the stigma of servitude in a generation. In America, field hands had almost no chance of manumission. Domestic slaves might occasionally be freed, often for personal reasons, but the overwhelming majority of enslaved people remained in bondage for life, their children inheriting their condition. Talent did not open doors. Skin color closed them. This divergence reflects the core difference between the two societies. Rome's slavery was a broad net, catching people from all walks of life and assigning them roles according to the needs of the empire. Some were broken in mines, others honored in libraries, but all were part of the same institution. America's slavery was narrow and brutal, defined by race and concentrated in agriculture, reducing millions to field labor regardless of who they were or what they could do. The system was not interested in potential, it was interested in profit, and profit was measured in acres picked and pounds harvested. Yet beneath these differences lies a shared truth. Whether in a Roman villa or an American cotton field, the enslaved lived lives shaped by powerlessness. The Greek philosopher who taught a senator's son could be sold tomorrow. The African woman in the fields could watch her child sold away and never see him again. Skill or proximity might ease the chains, but it could not remove them. Both systems reduced human beings to instruments, valued not for who they were, but for what they could produce. The comparison between Rome's skilled servants and America's field hands is not a contrast of better and worse, but of different faces of the same cruelty. One face wore the mask of refinement, displaying a cultured slave as proof of status. The other wore the mask of efficiency, driving field hands under the sun to squeeze profit from every drop of sweat. Both faces concealed the same truth, that slavery in any form strips people of freedom, dignity, and self. The tutor reciting Virgil and the woman bent in a cotton row lived in different worlds, but both were caught in the same system of bondage. The difference lay in how their societies imagined usefulness, but the chain around the neck was the same. To speak of slavery is to speak of survival, and often of the absence of it. The systems built in Rome and America were not designed with the longevity of the enslaved in mind. They were designed with productivity in mind. Yet the ways in which each society measured productivity shaped how long an enslaved person could expect to live and what sort of brutality defined their days. In Rome, the mines and farms devoured lives so quickly that they became synonymous with death. In America, the lash and the endless rhythm of 16-hour field days ground bodies down more slowly, but with the same disregard for human endurance. Comparing these systems is to place side by side two variations of cruelty, different in detail but similar in their core calculation. That a human life was expendable so long as profit was preserved. In the Roman world, the mines were the bottom rung of slavery. Sentenced criminals, prisoners of war, and unwanted slaves were dispatched into the earth to claw out metal and stone for the empire. Silver, copper, and gold flowed from Spain, Thrace, and Asia Minor, extracted by hands that rarely survived long enough to see the light again. Ancient writers themselves acknowledged the horror. The historian Diodorus Siculus described men worked until their bodies gave out, forced to labour by torchlight, whipped when they faltered, and dying in large numbers from exhaustion, disease, and collapse. There was no thought of preservation here. A slave in the mines was not an investment to be maintained, but a disposable tool to be used until it broke. Life expectancy was sometimes measured in months, not years, and replacement was always available through conquest. Agriculture was little kinder. The great latifundia, sprawling estates owned by Rome's elites, required constant attention. Olive groves, wheat fields, and vineyards were tended by gangs of chained labourers who lived in barracks, locked up at night to prevent escape. Overseers wielded whips to enforce the day's work, and punishment was brutal for those who lagged or resisted. These rural slaves were often shackled as they ploughed, their bodies literally bound to the land they cultivated. Though not as instantly lethal as the mines, the fields consumed lives steadily, their toll reflected in the fact that many landowners expected high turnover and did little to maintain the health of their workers. A sick or injured slave was replaced, not treated. Rome's agricultural empire, which fed millions, was fertilized by the broken bodies of those who made it possible. In the city, survival odds were better, but brutality was never far. Household slaves, scribes, and tutors were less likely to die from exhaustion, yet they remained vulnerable to the whims of their masters. A single act of disobedience, a perceived slight, or even the suspicion of disloyalty could lead to whipping, mutilation, or execution. Roman law permitted masters wide latitude in punishment, and though later reforms placed some limits on killing, the essential truth remained. A slave's life was precarious, their fate dependent entirely on another's will. Even when not worked to death, they lived under constant threat, and longevity was no guarantee of dignity. America's system functioned with a different logic, one shaped by race and economics. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were not disposable in the same way Roman miners were, at least not in theory. By the 19th century, the transatlantic trade had been closed, and slaveholders relied on natural reproduction to sustain their labor force. This gave them an incentive, however perverse, to keep slaves alive long enough to work, breed, and raise children who would themselves be enslaved. But alive did not mean safe. The conditions of plantation life ensured a slow destruction of body and spirit, one that shortened lives and scarred generations. Field hands bore the brunt of this system. From dawn until dusk, often 16 hours in summer, they labored in cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. The work was grueling, fingers torn and blistered, backs bent until spines curved, feet raw from endless trudging through soil and water. Overseers carried whips not as symbols but as tools, lashing those who slowed, who resisted, who simply could not endure. Whipping was not an occasional punishment, but a regular instrument of discipline, so common that runaway ads often described scars as identifying marks. The lash carved its story into skin, a permanent reminder that survival meant submission to violence. The brutality extended beyond the fields. Enslaved women bore children under constant threat of separation, their bodies treated as both laborers and breeders. Many endured sexual violence from owners or overseers, a trauma that left scars no less real than the lash. Domestic slaves, though spared the fields, often faced relentless surveillance, verbal abuse, and the cruelty of proximity, forced to serve those who treated them as property in their most intimate moments. Even within the supposed safety of a household, survival was measured in obedience and silence. Mortality on American plantations was staggering. Infant death rates among enslaved families were double those of white families. Malnutrition, overwork, and disease cut lives short. In rice fields, where workers stood in stagnant water for hours, malaria and dysentery were rampant. In sugar regions, accidents in boiling houses claimed limbs and lives. For many, the years of adulthood were spent in a cycle of exhaustion, punctuated by punishments that could cripple or kill. And though the system theoretically sought to preserve life for reproduction, the indifference of owners often negated that incentive. If one slave died, another could be purchased or bred. The system did not grieve, it simply calculated. Comparing Rome and America reveals a cruel spectrum of survival odds. Roman slaves in mines and farms often faced near-certain death within short spans of time, their lives consumed rapidly by labor designed to extract maximum value without concern for longevity. Urban Roman slaves, while better off, still lived under the daily possibility of violent punishment. American slaves in the fields endured longer lives on average, but those lives were defined by constant toil, systematic violence, and the slow grinding down of body and spirit. The lash replaced the mine's collapse as the instrument of destruction, but the outcome was the same: shortened lives, early graves, and generations of suffering. The different survival odds reflected each society's needs. Rome's expansion provided a steady supply of captives, so lives could be spent freely, replaced as quickly as they were lost. America, after the trade ended, needed slaves to reproduce, so it balanced cruelty with maintenance, allowing just enough survival to keep the system replenished. Yet both societies treated slaves not as human beings, but as resources to be managed. Death was a cost of doing business, and whether that cost came quickly in a mine or slowly in a cotton field, it was a cost the system was willing to pay. What made American slavery especially insidious was its intergenerational nature. Survival odds were not just about an individual's lifespan, but about the inheritance of bondage. A Roman slave might hope for manumission, slim as the chance was, and if freed, his children could be citizens. In America, survival often meant passing chains down to the next generation, ensuring that even if one endured, his children and grandchildren would inherit the same fate. Life expectancy was not just shortened, it was transformed into a lineage of captivity, where survival meant more slaves for the system. In both Rome and America, survival was an act of resistance. To live through another day in the mines, to endure another season in the fields, was to defy a system that expected you to break. Slaves found ways to care for each other, to share food, songs, and stories that reminded them of their humanity. In Rome, slaves prayed to household gods, sang in their native tongues, or scratched secret messages into walls. In America, spirituals carried coded meanings, hope of escape, and promises of a better world. These acts did not erase brutality, but they carved out spaces of endurance within it. Survival itself became a weapon, a way to deny the total erasure the system sought to impose. Life expectancy and brutality were not accidents in either system. They were features, not flaws, designed to maximize profit, enforce control, and discourage resistance. Rome consumed lives quickly and replaced them through conquest. America consumed lives more slowly but ensured the cycle never ended by making slavery hereditary. Both reveal the terrifying efficiency of cruelty when harnessed to power, and both leave us with numbers that stagger but also with silences, the countless lives cut short, the voices never heard, the graves unmarked. In the end, comparing survival odds in Rome and America is not about which was worse. It is about recognizing that both systems turned human life into a calculation, whether by exhausting it rapidly in mines or grinding it down across decades in fields. The lash and the 16-hour day, the mine shaft and the chained plough, all were different faces of the same truth, that when a society decides people can be property, life itself becomes expendable, survival becomes a lottery, brutality becomes ordinary, and the human cost becomes incalculable. Law is a mirror, and in the societies of Rome and America, the law reflected exactly what slavery was meant to be. Both civilizations wrote into their codes the assumption that some human beings could be reduced to property. Both gave masters near absolute authority over the bodies of others. Both carved punishments into statutes that were as much warnings as they were regulations. Yet the way Rome and America framed slavery and law shows striking differences. Rome's codes treated slaves primarily as things, chattel to be owned, lent, and inherited, while occasionally acknowledging them as humans with just enough protection to maintain order. America's slave codes took that same reduction to property and hardened it through race, spelling out in exhaustive detail how blackness itself would be bound to servitude, and how deviation from the system would be met with violent correction. To read these laws is to see cruelty not as accident but as policy. In Rome, slavery was assumed in the very structure of law. The great compilers of Roman jurisprudence, Gaius, Ulpian, Justinian, wrote of slaves not as citizens but as property under the dominium of their masters. A slave could not legally marry, could not own property, could not testify against a free person in court. If harmed by another, it was not the slave who was wronged but the master who could sue for damages just as if his livestock had been injured. The Latin word res, thing, was applied to them. In the eyes of the law, they were objects, albeit speaking objects. But Roman law was not entirely blind to their humanity, even if only for pragmatic reasons. The fear of revolt haunted masters, and so certain limits were eventually introduced. Under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, a law was issued that made it a crime to kill a slave deliberately, punishable as homicide. This was a radical shift, even if enforcement was inconsistent. Earlier in the time of Augustus, manumission had been regulated, setting conditions for freeing slaves, which both acknowledged their potential to become citizens and kept the process under state control. Other edicts prohibited extreme mutilation, though flogging, branding, and chaining remained perfectly legal. The point was not to protect the dignity of the enslaved, but to keep the system functioning smoothly, preventing cruelty from sparking resistance. Collective punishment was one of Rome's most chilling legal provisions. If a master was killed by a slave, all slaves in that household could be executed, regardless of their individual guilt. The logic was deterrence. Fear would bind loyalty where kindness could not. In one notorious case under Nero, a senator was murdered by a single slave, and 400 slaves of the household were executed en masse despite public outcry. The law recognized no individuality among the enslaved. They were a unit, a collective liability, whose survival depended on their master's safety. The punishments for disobedience or flight were codified in practice, if not always in text. Runaways might be branded on the forehead with the letters FUG for fugitivus, marking them forever as escapees. Others were forced to carry the furca, a heavy wooden yoke, through the streets in humiliation. Crucifixion, the most infamous of Roman punishments, was often reserved for rebellious slaves, its public spectacle a reminder of the consequences of defiance. Execution in the arena, fed to beasts or forced to fight as gladiators, was another legal and theatrical form of punishment. These were not random acts of cruelty, but sanctioned by custom and law, integrated into the Roman vision of justice for those who were not considered fully human. In America, the slave codes were even more explicit, spelling out every dimension of control. From the 17th century onward, colonial assemblies and later state legislatures passed laws that defined slavery in racial and hereditary terms. Virginia's 1662 law declared that a child's status followed the condition of the mother, ensuring that the children of enslaved women were themselves enslaved, regardless of the father. This principle, known as partus sequitur ventrum, transformed the womb into legal machinery for reproducing bondage. Where Rome saw slaves as spoils or debtors, America saw them as a permanent caste, defined before birth. The American slave codes left little room for ambiguity. Enslaved people were barred from learning to read or write, from assembling without white supervision, from owning weapons, from testifying against whites in court, from striking a white person even in self-defense. In Louisiana, the Black Code of 1806 declared that slaves were entirely subject to the will of their masters, who could chastise them at discretion so long as the punishment did not rise to unusual rigor. But what counted as unusual was conveniently vague, leaving space for virtually any cruelty. Some states fined owners for extreme abuse, but those fines were rarely enforced, and the testimony of slaves was inadmissible. The law, in effect, guaranteed impunity for almost any violence. Punishments in America were written into these codes with terrifying specificity. A runaway could be whipped, branded, or have ears cropped. Harboring a runaway carried penalties for free blacks and whites alike, ensuring complicity in enforcement. Rebellions were answered with exemplary violence, often preemptively. After Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, Virginia executed 56 slaves and mobs killed as many as 100 more, some with no proven connection to the uprising. The law sanctioned this collective punishment, echoing Rome's earlier practices, but now justified not by fear of a single household rebellion, but by racial panic across entire states. Where Rome allowed for manumission as a legal process, American law grew increasingly hostile to it. Some states passed restrictions requiring freed slaves to leave the state within a year of manumission, fearing that free blacks would encourage rebellion. Others imposed fees or legal hurdles that made manumission rare. Even when granted freedom, black people were subject to laws that curtailed their rights, reinforcing the racial caste system. Freedom itself was policed. Both Rome and America used law not just to regulate slavery, but to reassure the free population that the system was legitimate. In Rome, the legal codes rationalized slavery as an accepted consequence of war, debt, or crime. In America, the slave codes rationalized it as a natural condition tied to race. Both legal systems provided tools for control: the whip, the brand, the executioner in one, the patrol, the auction block, the written statute in the other. Both blurred the line between law and violence, ensuring that punishment was always visible and always exemplary. Yet the differences are instructive. Rome's law treated slavery as a broad institution, one that could, in theory, encompass anyone. A Roman citizen might fall into slavery through debt, and a Greek philosopher might rise from slavery through manumission. The law reflected this fluidity, cruel as it was. America's codes, by contrast, eliminated fluidity altogether. Race drew a line that law never allowed to be crossed. A black child was a slave for life. A white child was not. The law of Rome explained slavery as accident and circumstance. The law of America explained it as destiny. For the enslaved, the law was not protection but prison. In Rome, an enslaved man beaten to death might trigger a legal case, not for his sake, but for his master's loss. In America, a murdered slave might result in no penalty at all, or at most a fine. In both cases, the law was tilted so completely toward ownership that the enslaved had no recourse. Their voices were absent from the courtroom, their experiences irrelevant unless they intersected with the property rights of their owners. Justice in its formal sense was not theirs to claim, and yet both societies revealed their fear through law. Rome feared revolt, and so collective punishment and crucifixion loomed over every act of resistance. America feared insurrection and escape, and so the codes obsessed over literacy, movement, and gatherings. Laws betray anxieties, and in both cases the anxieties were of control slipping away. The very need for such detailed statutes shows that slavery was never natural, never uncontested. It had to be enforced constantly, written into stone and parchment, backed by lash and gallows. The law of the land in both Rome and America tells us less about justice and more about power. It was not about what was right or fair, but about what ensured domination. Rome codified property, America codified race. Rome allowed occasional mercy through manumission. America shut the door with hereditary chains. But in both, the enslaved stood outside the circle of legal protection, living under rules designed not for their benefit, but for their subjugation. The law was not a shield, but a whip written down, an edict of power disguised as order. To read these laws now is to see how societies justify the unjust. Words on a page give cruelty the weight of legitimacy, transforming violence into policy. In Rome, the digest of Justinian preserved the logic that slaves were things. In America, state codes spelled out with chilling clarity that blackness itself was bondage. These were not aberrations but deliberate choices, engraved in law to make sure that chains held tight. And in both worlds, those chains were not only iron but ink, binding lives not just with force but with the authority of the law itself. Family is often described as the core of human life, the bond that shapes identity and gives meaning to survival. Yet in the world of slavery, family became something fragile, something constantly threatened, something always at risk of being torn apart. For both Rome and America, the enslaved lived in systems where the law itself denied them the security of marriage and kinship. Love was always precarious, children were always vulnerable, and separation was an ever-present shadow. The stories of family under slavery are not just tales of loss, but also of resilience, of people who insisted on loving one another even when their societies refused to recognize those bonds. But the shape of that love and the forms of its destruction differed in Rome and America, revealing the cruel ingenuity with which both systems attacked the most basic human connections. In Rome, the legal impossibility of marriage was the first assault. Slaves could not contract matrimonium, the recognized bond of husband and wife that granted rights of inheritance, legitimacy for children, and the protection of the state. A slave couple might live together, raise children together, and be regarded by neighbors as a household, But in the eyes of Roman law, they were merely concubinales, companions who shared a bed at their master's discretion. Their union could be tolerated, even encouraged, but never sanctified. At any moment, the master could sell one partner, reassign another to a different household, or separate children without consequence. The family existed only as long as it suited the owner. Yet within these constraints, slaves still formed attachments. Couples pledged themselves to one another informally, shared lives in crowded quarters, and raised children who carried both pride and despair. Love could blossom even in chains, though it was always under threat. Some masters, recognizing the stability it brought, allowed such unions to persist, thinking that bonds of affection would discourage rebellion or flight. Others exploited them, threatening to separate partners as a form of punishment or leveraging children's futures to enforce obedience. For the enslaved, the act of loving became an act of defiance, a claim to humanity in a world determined to deny it. Children were at the heart of this precariousness. The offspring of slaves in Rome were themselves slaves, born into servitude by the principle partus sequitur ventrem centuries before America codified the same rule. Infants could be cherished by their parents, yet they were legally nothing more than their master's property. A father could not protect a son from sale. A mother could not guarantee a daughter's future. Infanticide, while rare, was not unknown, sometimes committed by desperate parents unwilling to see a child grow up in chains. More often, parents poured their love into children they knew they might lose, creating families that survived on borrowed time. In America, the denial of family was even more brutal because it was racialized and commercialized. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were denied the right to legal marriage, just as in Rome. But the practice of selling people at auction turned separation into a public spectacle. Families were literally torn apart on the block, children crying as mothers screamed, husbands dragged away while wives begged in vain. Traders prided themselves on their ability to maximize profit, and if that meant selling a young man separately from his wife and children, so be it. A mother might see her baby sold from her arms, a teenager sold to a distant plantation never to be seen again. These were not isolated tragedies, but routine features of the system. The auction block was perhaps the most infamous stage for this cruelty. Men, women, and children were inspected like livestock, their bodies prodded, their teeth examined, their muscles pinched to assess strength. Prospective buyers cared little for the families they dismantled. A boy might be sold because he fetched a good price, his siblings left behind to grieve. A husband might be sold to cover a master's debts, his wife remarried against her will to another slave. Every auction was a lottery of despair, reducing bonds of kinship to collateral damage in the pursuit of profit. Plantation records and slave narratives are filled with memories of such separations. Frederick Douglass recalled the cries of children taken from mothers too soon. Harriet Jacobs described the fear that haunted every slave mother, the dread that her children would be sold away. The testimony is overwhelming. The greatest sorrow of slavery was not just the lash or the toil, but the ever-present threat that love itself could be destroyed at the whim of another. Even in America, some masters tolerated or encouraged marriages among their slaves, but always for their own ends. Stable families meant more children, and more children meant more slaves. A mother's womb was an investment, and bonds of affection were twisted into tools for reproduction. Some owners paired strong men with women to breed, ignoring any feelings of the people involved. The very intimacy of family was turned into economic strategy, reducing the most personal of human bonds to a ledger entry. The impossibility of legal protection made these families fragile, but it did not make them meaningless. Across both Rome and America, slaves clung to one another, creating families in defiance of law. In Rome, some masters allowed ceremonies that mimicked marriage, giving slaves the illusion of formal union. In America, enslaved couples jumped the broom, and symbolic rituals that marked their bond, even though the state refused to recognize it. These acts were powerful not because they altered legal status, but because they affirmed humanity. They declared, "We are more than property. We are husband and wife, mother and child, family, despite the law." Still, the pain of separation loomed like a storm. In Rome, the sale of slaves was constant, and families were torn apart without ceremony. A child raised alongside his parents might one day be sold to another household, vanishing from their lives with no hope of reunion. In America, the violence was more systematic and more public. Auctions institutionalized separation, turning grief into commerce, tears into profit. Both systems reveal the fragility of love under slavery, but America's transformation of family into a market commodity added a layer of cruelty that left scars across generations. The consequences of these practices rippled outward. In Rome, freedmen often struggled to reconnect with family they had lost, sometimes purchasing relatives to reunite them. In America, the end of slavery did not erase the legacy of broken families. Freed people spent years after emancipation searching for loved ones, placing ads in newspapers, walking from town to town with only memories to guide them. Many never found those they sought. The trauma of separation echoed long after the auction block was gone, shaping African American communities with a history of loss that was both deeply personal and widely shared. The denial of family also served to reinforce the ideology of slavery. By preventing slaves from forming secure bonds, masters could argue that they were incapable of civilized life, incapable of stable households, incapable of the virtues that free citizens supposedly embodied. This was circular cruelty. The very system that destroyed families was used as proof that the enslaved were unfit for freedom. Rome justified slavery as natural consequence of conquest. America justified it as racial destiny, and the destruction of family was twisted into evidence. Yet the resilience of enslaved families is just as much a part of the story as their fragility. In Rome, parents taught children skills, traditions, and stories even within bondage. In America, enslaved families preserved songs, faith, and rituals that carried memory and hope. Love endured even when law denied it, creating underground networks of kinship that defied the system. To love in such conditions was itself an act of resistance, a refusal to let oppression define every aspect of life. The impossibility of legal marriage in Rome and the brutality of auction blocks in America may look different, but both reveal how slavery sought to unravel the most basic ties of humanity. In Rome, the denial was subtle, a quiet erasure of legal recognition. In America, it was loud and public, a marketplace of grief. Both inflicted wounds that cut deeper than physical punishment, because they struck at identity, belonging, and the future itself. And yet, in both, the enslaved refused to stop loving, refused to stop forming families, refused to surrender the bonds that made them human. In the end, the story of family under slavery is one of both sorrow and resilience. Children were torn from parents, lovers were separated, households dismantled. The law offered no protection, and the market thrived on destruction. But through whispered vows, symbolic rituals, lullabies sung in the dark, and endless searches for lost kin, enslaved people asserted their humanity in the face of systems determined to deny it. The impossibility of legal marriage in Rome and the brutal auction blocks of America may have tried to erase family, but they never succeeded entirely. The love of the enslaved, fragile and threatened though it was, outlived the empires that sought to destroy it. Fear is the constant companion of every master who built his life on domination. To own another human being is to live with the knowledge that the bond between you is not natural, not voluntary, and not secure. It is to wonder in the quiet of night whether the servant carrying your wine has slipped something bitter into the cup. whether the man tending your horse will one day ride it to freedom, whether the woman sewing your tunic dreams of fire and vengeance. Both Rome and America, for all their differences, lived under this shadow. Slavery gave elites wealth and power, but it also gave them nightmares. From Spartacus to Nat Turner, the possibility of rebellion haunted their worlds, shaping laws, customs, punishments, and the psychology of entire societies. In Rome, this fear was woven into the very fabric of empire. The Spartacus revolt of 73 BCE was not the first uprising, but it became the most famous precisely because it revealed the scale of the threat. Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, led a band of escaped slaves that swelled to tens of thousands, defeating Roman legions again and again before finally being crushed. The rebellion terrified the Republic not only because it was militarily dangerous, but because it exposed a fragile truth. The enslaved outnumbered citizens in some regions, and if they acted together, they could shatter the illusion of control. The crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way was not just punishment. It was theatre. The bodies lined the road as a permanent warning to every slave who dreamed of following Spartacus. Rome used terror to ensure obedience because it knew terror was the only barrier between master and servant. Other revolts, smaller but no less frightening, punctuated Roman history. In Sicily, mass uprisings of rural slaves in the 2nd century BCE overran estates and cities, forcing Rome to send armies to suppress them. The sheer persistence of rebellion demonstrated that the enslaved never accepted their condition as natural. They fought with whatever weapons they could find, from stolen swords to farming tools, their desperation fueling resistance even when the odds were hopeless. For the Roman elite, each revolt confirmed that leniency was dangerous. Laws hardened, punishments became harsher, and surveillance tightened. To the masters, kindness might breed complacency, but it might also breed confidence. Fear had to be constant, and terror had to be visible. This dread was not confined to the battlefield or the countryside. In the city, rumors of plots circulated regularly. A kitchen slave might be accused of conspiring to poison his master. A doorman might be suspected of plotting escape with his comrades. The Senate, aware of how close slaves lived to their masters, insisted on maintaining the sharpest boundaries between free and enslaved. When the idea of giving slaves uniforms was debated, it was abandoned not out of mercy but out of fear. What if they realized how many they were? The elites knew they were vastly outnumbered, and the sight of thousands dressed alike might remind the enslaved of their strength. Rome's political class lived with this tension. They depended on slaves for everything, but they knew that dependence made them vulnerable. Centuries later, in America, the same shadow hung over the South. The institution of slavery, especially in the 19th century, relied on a racial ideology that claimed Africans were docile, suited for servitude, incapable of civilization without white masters. But beneath this mythology lurked fear, constant and gnawing. The very existence of slave patrols, armed white men riding through the night to check passes, chase runaways and terrorize black communities, was a confession of anxiety. If slavery were truly natural, why would it require such relentless policing? The answer was obvious: because the enslaved resisted, and because whites feared what would happen if they resisted successfully. The spectre of Haiti loomed especially large. When enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue rose up in 1791, fought off French, Spanish and British armies, and created the first Black Republic, planters across the American South trembled. Here was proof that slaves could not only rebel, but win. The Haitian Revolution became a nightmare vision, invoked in speeches, whispered in taverns, and used to justify harsher controls at home. American elites tightened restrictions on literacy, assembly and movement, fearing that knowledge and communication were sparks that could ignite revolt. Laws banning teaching slaves to read were less about denying education for its own sake and more about denying the ability to spread ideas of freedom. And still, rebellions came. Gabriel's planned revolt in 1800, Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in 1822, and most famously Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 showed that despite constant surveillance and brutal punishments, enslaved people continued to dream of liberation through force. Nat Turner, a preacher in Virginia, gathered followers who killed around 60 whites in a wave of fury that shook the South to its core. The rebellion was put down swiftly, but its psychological impact was enormous. Planters suddenly saw every black face as a potential enemy. Panic spread. Mobs murdered not only suspected rebels but also free blacks who had no connection to the uprising. Legislatures responded with new slave codes that tightened restrictions still further, banning black preaching, forbidding assembly, and heightening patrols. Just as Rome had crucified thousands to make a point, America used executions and massacres to etch fear into the memory of the enslaved. The parallels are striking. Rome crucified rebels on roads. America hung them from trees. Rome executed entire households for a master's murder. America killed dozens of people suspected of conspiracy, often without trial. Both systems relied on collective punishment to deter others, turning cruelty into a policy of prevention. The law and the lash worked hand in hand, ensuring that the enslaved were reminded daily of the costs of resistance. Yet the very need for such measures revealed the fragility of the system. If slavery were secure, it would not require this constant drumbeat of terror. The excess of violence was proof of insecurity. Elites in both societies responded to fear by cultivating division. In Rome, the diversity of the enslaved, Greeks, Gauls, Syrians, Germans, made large-scale unity difficult, and masters exploited this by separating groups, pitting one against another, and rewarding loyalty with privileges. In America, division was drawn along race. Poor whites were given just enough status to make them complicit, encouraged to see themselves as superior to blacks despite sharing poverty and hardship. This psychological wage, as W.E.B. Du Bois later called it, turned potential allies into enemies, ensuring that rebellion would not unite the underclass across color lines. Fear of revolt shaped not just punishment but the very social architecture of both societies. The terror extended beyond law into culture. In Rome, plays and satires sometimes mocked rebellious slaves, reducing them to comic figures whose comeuppance reaffirmed order. In America, newspapers printed lurid accounts of conspiracies, often exaggerated or fabricated, to stoke white fear and justify harsher measures. In both cases, the dominant class used narrative to frame rebellion as monstrous, unnatural, something to be stamped out at all costs. Yet these stories also betrayed fascination. Spartacus became legendary, Turner infamous because they represented the nightmare masters could not stop imagining. The enslaved rising up to reverse the order of the world. What is perhaps most telling is that despite the constant terror, revolts never stopped. In Rome, small-scale resistance, poisonings, arson, tool-breaking, was constant, and occasional mass uprisings erupted despite the odds. In America, the Underground Railroad, work slowdowns, and open revolts all demonstrated that fear flowed both ways. Masters feared rebellion, but slaves refused to surrender the dream of freedom. Every crucifixion, every hanging, every mutilation was meant to extinguish that dream, but instead it confirmed that freedom was worth dying for. Fear of revolt shaped the daily lives of masters just as much as it did slaves. Roman senators dined with slaves standing at their shoulders, knives in hand to carve meat, and wondered whether loyalty would hold another day. Southern planters slept in big houses surrounded by cabins full of people they had beaten, sold, and violated, always aware that the darkness outside their windows might conceal rebellion. Wealth did not buy peace of mind, it bought constant anxiety. The very foundations of their privilege were unstable, built on a system that required perpetual violence to sustain itself. Spartacus and Nat Turner stand as symbols of this fear, but they were not alone. They were simply the most visible among countless others whose names are lost. For every open revolt, there were dozens of conspiracies, hundreds of small acts of resistance, thousands of whispered dreams of vengeance. Rome and America remembered the uprisings with terror, but for the enslaved, they were moments of hope, proof that chains could be broken, however briefly. In the end, fear of revolt tells us as much about masters as it does about slaves. It reveals that slavery was never natural, never secure, never truly accepted. It had to be enforced with terror precisely because the enslaved always resisted, in small ways or large, with subtle defiance or open war. Rome's crucifixions and America's gallows were not signs of strength but of weakness, admissions that domination was fragile and temporary. The Empire of Marble and the Republic of Cotton alike were haunted by the same truth, that those they sought to own could never be fully owned, and that love of freedom, however crushed, could always rise again in rebellion. Freedom for the enslaved was never a simple question of chains falling away. It was a matter of law, of money, of chance, of a master's whim, or of the tremors of politics and war. Both Rome and America dangled freedom in front of the enslaved, but they did so in very different ways, and with very different consequences. In Rome, manumission was a visible part of the system woven into the fabric of society. A slave might accumulate savings called peculium, or win the favor of a master, and find himself transformed into a freedman with rights and responsibilities. In America, by contrast, freedom was elusive, almost impossible, and always precarious. Self-purchase was rare, emancipation rarer still, and even when chains were broken by law, the promise of liberty came shackled to racism and repression. The contrast between Rome's structured, if limited, path to freedom and America's deliberately narrow gates reveals not only differences in law, but differences in how each society imagined slavery itself. In Rome, manumission was common enough to be a recognizable feature of life. A master could free a slave for loyalty, for years of service, or simply as a gesture of generosity. Freedmen formed a distinct social class, standing between the enslaved and full citizens. They could not hold high office, but they could own property, conduct business, and raise children who would become full citizens in the next generation. The process of manumission took several forms. The most formal was through a ceremony before a magistrate, where the master declared the slave free, often tapping him with a ceremonial rod called a vindicta. Another method was by will, where a master promised freedom upon his death. A less formal route, informally tolerated, was simply to declare a slave free in the presence of friends or family. In every case, the law recognized the new status, creating a bridge between bondage and citizenship. The peculium was crucial in this system. Though technically still the property of the master, it functioned as a kind of personal fund that a slave could manage. A skilled slave, like a scribe, doctor, or artisan, might be allowed to keep a portion of his earnings in this account. Over time, if fortune and master's tolerance allowed, he could save enough to purchase his freedom. This gave the enslaved a form of agency, however limited. It also gave masters an incentive to allow slaves to develop skills, since the prospect of eventual manumission encouraged loyalty and productivity. The peculium did not make slavery humane, but it made freedom thinkable, and it created a social pipeline by which slaves could enter Roman society as freedmen, often maintaining ties of obligation to their former masters. Freedmen in Rome could thrive. Some became wealthy merchants, landowners, or administrators. Many retained a patron-client relationship with their former masters, offering loyalty and service in exchange for protection and prestige. Their children, born free, could climb even higher, entering the ranks of citizens with the full privileges of Roman law. The stories of freedmen like Narcissus, who wielded influence in the court of Claudius, show how far this path could go. At the same time, freedmen carried a stigma, their origins never fully forgotten, their social status always a reminder that freedom had been granted, not inherited. Still, in Rome, the possibility of becoming free was woven into the lives of millions, shaping both hope and behavior. In America, the situation was starkly different. The law treated slavery as hereditary and racial, designed to be permanent. Paths to freedom existed, but they were narrow, treacherous, and rare. Self-purchase was one possibility, but few enslaved people ever had the chance. Unlike Rome's peculium, American slaves were not formally allowed to accumulate personal wealth. Some masters permitted them to work for wages during off hours or to cultivate small garden plots, selling produce for money. In a handful of cases, these earnings could be saved toward the purchase of freedom. But the costs were enormous. A strong young man might be valued at hundreds or thousands of dollars, far beyond what most could realistically gather. Moreover, even if a slave raised the money, freedom depended on the master's willingness to sell. Many refused, preferring to keep valuable laborers or fearing that granting liberty to one might inspire demands from others. There were stories of success. Venture Smith, captured in Africa and enslaved in New England, eventually bought his own freedom, then purchased his wife and children. In 1839, records from Cincinnati showed that 42% of free blacks had gained liberty through self-purchase. These examples, though inspiring, were exceptions, not the rule. For every Venture Smith, there were countless others who saved for years only to be cheated, refused, or betrayed. Hope flickered, but was often extinguished by the realities of a system designed not to allow escape, but to perpetuate itself. Manumission in America was possible, especially in earlier centuries, but it declined sharply as the system hardened. In the 18th century, some masters freed slaves in their wills, often citing religious conviction or guilt. Revolutionary ideals led to a wave of manumissions, especially in the Upper South, where Quakers and other groups pressed for emancipation. In Virginia and Maryland, large numbers of enslaved people gained freedom in the decades after independence. But by the early 19th century, backlash had set in. Legislatures passed laws making manumission more difficult, requiring freed people to leave the state or imposing heavy fines. The fear of rebellion, stoked by events like Gabriel's conspiracy and Nat Turner's revolt, convinced slaveholders that freedom for some was a danger to all. By 1860, the door to manumission was nearly closed, and the enslaved population had swelled to nearly 4 million. For many, the only realistic path to freedom was escape. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of routes and safe houses, carried thousands north to free states or Canada. The risks were enormous. Runaways faced dogs, patrols, bounty hunters, and the constant threat of betrayal. Families were often left behind, torn apart by the attempt. Yet the yearning for liberty was strong enough that many risked everything. Escape stories became legends. Harriet Tubman guiding scores to safety. Frederick Douglass disguising himself to flee bondage. Countless others whose names are lost, but whose determination carried them through forests and rivers to uncertain refuge. These escapes were the closest equivalent America had to Rome's peculium, a desperate gamble where courage and luck replaced coins saved in a chest. The great rupture in America came not from individual efforts, but from national cataclysm. The Civil War transformed the question of freedom into a political necessity. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared enslaved people in Confederate states free, though its reach was limited by the war's progress. With the Union victory in 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished nationwide. freed not by purchase, not by manumission, not by escape, but by the stroke of constitutional law backed by military victory. Yet this freedom was shackled from the beginning. No land was granted, no reparations paid, no structures created to secure equality. Instead, freed people found themselves thrust into a hostile society that sought to keep them at the bottom through black codes, violence, and later Jim Crow laws. The chains had been broken, but the weight of bondage remained, reshaped into new forms of oppression. The difference between Rome and America in this regard is profound. In Rome, freedom was always a possibility, however slim. It could be earned, bought, or bestowed, and once granted, it allowed entry into society, even upward mobility for descendants. The presence of freedmen was a constant reminder that slavery was not always permanent, that fortune could change. In America, the system was designed to deny that possibility. Freedom was the rare exception, not the rule, and even when achieved, it carried permanent racial stigma. A freed black man in the antebellum South was still subject to discriminatory laws, barred from many professions, and always vulnerable to violence. His children inherited not citizenship but suspicion. Where Rome's manumission integrated former slaves into the state, America's emancipation left them outside, nominally free but structurally excluded. And yet, in both societies, freedom was never simply granted. It was fought for, dreamed of, and clung to. Roman slaves saved peculium in secret, negotiated with masters, or risked rebellion in hopes of winning liberty. American slaves saved pennies, risked flight, or waited for the thunder of war to bring deliverance. The paths were different, but the desire was the same. Both systems reveal that slavery, however powerful, could never extinguish the human hunger for freedom. The tragedy of these paths is that they were always constrained by the same paradox. The master had the power to grant or deny. In Rome, a master could reward loyalty with freedom or sell a man away the next day. In America, a master could allow self-purchase or crush the hope with a simple refusal. Freedom, when it came, was not a right, but a concession, and that concession was always fragile. Even in emancipation by law, as in 1865, freedom came with conditions imposed by the powerful, ensuring that liberty was never equal and never secure. The story of paths to freedom in Rome and America is a story of possibility and denial, of bridges built and walls raised. Rome offered a narrow bridge, fragile but real, leading from slavery into society. America raised walls high and thick, keeping millions inside until war blew them down. But in both cases, the enslaved themselves were the ones who walked, who climbed, who resisted, who dreamed. The law could open or close doors, but it could never kill the yearning to step through them. That yearning was the one freedom that could not be taken. And it is what connects the freedman of Rome to the runaway of America, the manumitted scribe to the emancipated field hand across centuries and continents in a shared defiance of chains. The story of slavery does not end when chains are broken. The deeper tale lies in what comes after, the legacy that lingers long after laws are rewritten and whips are put away. In Rome, the rise of freedmen carved legacies into stone, their names etched on monuments, their wealth displayed in villas, their children absorbed into the citizen body. In America, emancipation in 1865 brought freedom in name but not in reality. The cotton fields still defined the economy, racism became a new architecture of control, and those who had been freed found themselves tethered to systems of oppression that endured for generations. To compare the legacies of Rome's manumission with America's emancipation is to see two paths diverge, one leading to gradual integration and upward mobility, the other to systemic exclusion and the persistence of bondage in new forms. In Rome, freedmen were not an afterthought, but a visible class. Manumission was woven into the system, and freed slaves, though marked by their past, could rise to prominence. Their tombstones, scattered across the empire, testify to their presence. Inscribed in Latin, they proudly declared their names, their professions, and their achievements. A freedman might boast of his role as a baker, a merchant, a craftsman, or even a municipal official. These epitaphs were not simply records of death, but declarations of belonging, proof that a life once chained could end honored and remembered. The stone carried forward what slavery had tried to erase: the dignity of a person's name, the pride of a family line, the permanence of contribution. Some freedmen rose far higher than modest prosperity. In the imperial household, freedmen served as secretaries, administrators, and advisors. Men like Narcissus and Pallas, once slaves, wielded immense influence under emperors, controlling access to power and shaping imperial policy. Their wealth rivaled that of senators, and though their origins were never forgotten, their presence reshaped Roman society. Freedmen became patrons themselves, sponsoring clients, erecting monuments, and funding public works. Their children inherited freedom fully, becoming citizens indistinguishable from others. In just a generation, the stigma of slavery could be erased, replaced by the pride of Romanitas. The legacy of slavery in Rome then was paradoxical. While the system consumed millions, it also allowed some to carve their names into the story of the empire, leaving traces that endure in stone to this day. America's legacy unfolded in a darker register. When slavery ended in 1865, nearly 4 million people were freed, but the society they entered was not designed to include them. The cotton economy still depended on their labor, and new systems arose to bind them to the land. Sharecropping and tenant farming replaced slavery in name but not in practice, keeping freed people in cycles of debt that left them little better off than before. The very fields they had once worked under overseers remained their prison, only now disguised as contracts and credit arrangements. Cotton, the crop that had fueled the wealth of planters in the Industrial Revolution, still dictated black lives, its fibers entwined with systemic poverty that stretched across generations. The promise of Reconstruction briefly hinted at a different future. Freedmen built schools, established churches, and even won election to state legislatures and Congress. For a moment, it seemed as if America might follow a path closer to Rome's, integrating the formerly enslaved into civic life. But backlash was swift and violent. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, burning schools, lynching leaders, and silencing voices. Southern states rewrote laws to enforce black codes, restricting mobility, work, and civil rights. When federal troops withdrew in 1877, Reconstruction ended, and the dream of integration gave way to Jim Crow segregation. Unlike Rome, where freedmen's children could aspire to citizenship without distinction, African Americans in America remained trapped in a system that defined them as inferior, no matter how many generations had passed since emancipation. The legacies of Rome and America diverged most clearly in how each remembered its freedmen. In Rome, monuments, inscriptions, and public rolls ensured that freedmen were part of the historical record. Their names endure, visible to archaeologists and historians centuries later. In America, the achievements of freed people were systematically erased. Black success was met with violence. Prosperous black towns like Greenwood in Tulsa were destroyed in massacres, their legacies burned and buried. History books downplayed or ignored the role of freed people in Reconstruction, portraying them as passive or incapable rather than as builders of schools, communities, and institutions. Where Rome's freedmen left legacies in stone, America's freed people often left legacies in oral traditions, stories passed down through families. Fragile against the weight of institutional forgetting, the economic differences are equally telling. Roman freedmen could accumulate wealth, run businesses, and even owned slaves themselves, a bitter irony that underscored their integration into the very system they had escaped. Their children could inherit wealth and status, breaking the cycle of poverty in a single generation. In America, freed people were denied land reform, denied access to capital, and denied fair wages. The promise of 40 acres and a mule never materialized, leaving black families to start freedom with nothing. Generations later, the wealth gap between black and white Americans remains one of the most enduring legacies of slavery, a direct consequence of the refusal to integrate freed people economically after emancipation. Social mobility also followed opposite trajectories. A freedman in Rome might become a patron, his son a citizen, his grandson indistinguishable from peers. In America, social mobility was blocked at every turn. Black codes, poll taxes, literacy tests, and segregation ensured that freed people and their descendants remained on the margins. Even extraordinary achievements were met with backlash. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Frederick Douglass were towering figures, but their influence was often contested or undermined by a society that resisted black advancement. Unlike Rome, where the system, however cruel, incorporated freedmen into its structure, America preserved freedom in law while denying equality in practice. Cultural legacies diverged too. Roman freedmen embraced the symbols of Roman identity, Latin names, Roman dress, Roman customs, using them to assert belonging. Their tombstones speak the language of pride and assimilation, their inscriptions almost indistinguishable from those of freeborn citizens. American freed people, denied full acceptance, turned instead to create parallel cultural worlds. The black church became a cornerstone, offering not just spiritual refuge but also political organization and education. Music, from spirituals to blues to jazz, carried the memory of suffering and the hope of resilience. These cultural legacies were rich and enduring, but they arose in part because mainstream society refused to absorb black Americans fully, forcing them to build spaces of their own. Perhaps the most haunting difference lies in how each society's legacy shaped the present. In Rome, the existence of freedmen was a reminder that slavery, while brutal, was not always permanent, and that the state could absorb former slaves into its citizen body. This fluidity helped normalize slavery, but also created avenues for transformation. In America, the permanence of racial slavery left scars that outlived the institution. Even after the 13th Amendment, systemic racism ensured that freedom did not mean equality. The cotton fields gave way to segregated schools, red-lined neighborhoods, and mass incarceration, all mechanisms of exclusion that carried forward the logic of bondage. Rome's legacy of slavery can be read in stone epitaphs that celebrate freedmen's achievements. America's legacy can be read in statistics of inequality, in prisons filled disproportionately with black men, in neighborhoods shaped by the economic exclusion of generations. And yet, both Rome and America testify to resilience. Freedmen in Rome carved their names in stone to assert they had lived, loved, and achieved despite slavery. Freed people in America carved their legacy into song, sermon, and story, insisting on humanity despite systemic oppression. Where Rome offered integration, America forced resistance. But in both cases, the legacies endure, reminders that slavery never had the final word. The phrase "legacies in stone and cotton" captures this divergence. Rome's freedmen literally left their memory in stone, monuments that outlasted empire. America's freed people left their memory in cotton, a crop that symbolized both their bondage and their endurance, fields of suffering that became the foundation of a nation's wealth. Stone is durable, cotton fragile, and yet cotton carried across oceans became more global than any Roman epitaph. The legacies are different, but both speak to the ways slavery echoes through time, shaping societies long after the chains are gone. Rome's freedmen remind us that even in an empire of conquest, integration was possible. America's freed people remind us that emancipation without equality is a hollow promise, that freedom can be declared but still denied. To study them side by side is to see two futures imagined after slavery, one that allowed the formerly enslaved to rise, the other that kept them down. The legacies are written in stone and cotton, but also in memory, in blood, and in the ongoing struggle to turn freedom into something real. When we think of slavery, we tend to imagine it as something locked in the past, the chain clinking only in the Roman Forum or across the dusty auction blocks of the American South. We imagine it ended when Spartacus was crucified or when Union troops marched into the plantations of the Confederacy. But to believe that slavery is gone is to believe in a comforting lie. Its forms have changed, its disguises have multiplied, but the essence remains. People are still bought and sold, still trapped in systems they cannot leave, still stripped of their freedom for the profit of others. The echoes of Rome and America can be heard in today's world, not only in the way we remember the past, but in the realities of the present. Modern slavery is estimated to entrap between 38 and 50 million people worldwide, depending on how the term is measured. This number shocks, but it should not surprise us. Rome enslaved millions as the machinery of empire, and America enslaved millions as the backbone of its agricultural economy. Today's globalized economy, more hidden but no less ravenous, has created conditions where coercion, exploitation, and trafficking thrive. Forced labor, debt bondage, sexual exploitation, and child labor are the 21st century's versions of the same phenomenon. Human beings turned into instruments, stripped of autonomy, and treated as tools of wealth and power. One of the clearest echoes of Rome lies in forced labor. In ancient times, captives were set to work in mines, quarries, and fields, doing the dirty and dangerous jobs that free citizens avoided. Today, tens of millions are forced into similarly brutal labor. In South Asia, men and women toil in brick kilns under debt bondage, working endless hours in scorching heat to pay off loans that are designed never to be repaid. In the fishing industries of Southeast Asia, migrants are trapped on boats for months or years, beaten and starved if they resist, their labor fueling global seafood markets. In construction projects across parts of the Middle East, migrant workers find their passports confiscated, their wages withheld, and their freedom denied. Just as Roman slaves built aqueducts and temples for the glory of empire, today's invisible workers construct skyscrapers and stadiums for the pride of nations, often with their lives as collateral. The American shadow emerges most starkly in the persistence of racialized exploitation. The slave codes may be gone, but the structures built on them still shape societies. In the United States, the legacy of slavery lives on in mass incarceration, where disproportionately black and brown men are locked in prisons and compelled to work for pennies an hour. The 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, left a loophole. Slavery was abolished except as punishment for crime. That exception has become a pipeline. Prison labor produces goods and services worth billions, from call centers to furniture to agricultural products, echoing the plantation logic that black bodies can be controlled, confined, and made to produce for others. The auction block may be gone, but the prison yard fills its place in a society that has never fully shaken the logic of bondage. Human trafficking is perhaps the most visible reminder of how little the world has changed. Women and children are still bought and sold across borders, funneled into brothels, strip clubs, massage parlors, and private homes. Men are lured with promises of jobs, only to find themselves locked into agricultural or construction work with no means of escape. The methods differ. Now it is false contracts, confiscated passports, and threats against families rather than chains and whips. But the outcome is eerily familiar. Bodies are commodified. Consent is irrelevant. Profit dictates every calculation. The same exploitation that once filled Roman brothels and American plantations now fuels the sex trade and underground economies in every corner of the globe. Debt bondage, too, is an ancient echo. Rome enslaved debtors who could not pay, reducing them to property until the balance was cleared, if it ever was. Today, predatory systems of credit entrap the poor in similar cycles. Families in India, Pakistan, and Nepal pledge themselves to work off debts so small they seem trivial, only to find the terms stretch endlessly, binding them for life and passing the burden to their children. A loan for a medical emergency or a wedding becomes a chain that ties a family to a landlord or employer across generations. The language of debt replaces the language of conquest, but the result is the same: bondage justified by a contract that was never truly voluntary. Child labor is another chilling continuity. In both Rome and America, children of slaves inherited their parents' condition, their childhoods swallowed by labor. Roman children might serve as attendants in households or work in fields, while enslaved children in the American South carried water, weeded crops, or served masters long before they were old enough to understand the meaning of freedom. Today, millions of children still endure similar fates. In cocoa plantations of West Africa, in mines in the Congo, in garment factories in South Asia, children as young as 5 or 6 work long hours under dangerous conditions. Their tiny hands are prized for tasks requiring delicacy, their vulnerability exploited because they cannot resist. The world consumes chocolate, smartphones, and cheap clothing, rarely stopping to ask whether those goods are built on the labor of children whose childhoods have been stolen. The echoes also persist in ideology. Rome justified slavery as a natural outcome of conquest, the spoils of victory. America justified it by race, claiming Africans were inherently suited for bondage. Today, slavery is often disguised by rhetoric of necessity. Migrants are told they must endure exploitation to send money home. Women are told they are providing for families. Workers are told their contracts are binding. Just as in Rome and America, the powerful spin stories to make domination appear normal, inevitable, even justified. And just as before, these stories serve to obscure the brutality of the system, to make exploitation invisible to those who benefit from it. The hidden nature of modern slavery is one of its greatest shields. Roman slaves were visible in cities, tending shops and carrying water, while American slaves worked openly in fields and households. Everyone knew slavery was there. Today, slavery hides behind supply chains, subcontractors, and global markets. We eat food harvested by invisible hands, wear clothes stitched by invisible fingers, tap on devices mined by invisible children. The visibility has been replaced by distance, but the moral weight is no less. The empire of exploitation has simply become global, diffuse, and harder to see. Resistance too echoes. Just as Roman slaves ran away, poisoned masters, or rebelled, and American slaves escaped, revolted, or slowed their work, modern slaves resist in countless ways. Some flee and tell their stories, exposing traffickers and abusive systems. Others organize covertly, sharing information and supporting each other in camps and factories. NGOs and activists play the role once played by abolitionists, risking their safety to expose abuses and demand change. The parallels remind us that no matter how entrenched exploitation appears, those who endure it never fully surrender their will to resist. But the persistence of slavery also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. If Rome could not exist without slaves and America built its wealth on their backs, how much of our own world rests on similar exploitation? The cheap goods flooding global markets are made possible by labor conditions that echo bondage. The demand for fast fashion, inexpensive electronics, and endless consumer goods drives industries that prey on the desperate. Our comfort is too often purchased at the expense of someone else's chains. The shadows of Rome and America stretch into our supermarkets, our closets, and our phones. Memory itself is part of the legacy. Rome left monuments to freedmen, integrating them into its story. America left scars, erasing or distorting the role of enslaved people in its narrative. Today, the memory of slavery still divides societies. Debates over monuments, reparations, and the teaching of history reveal that the past is not settled but contested. To acknowledge slavery's echoes is to confront uncomfortable truths: that our prosperity is built on suffering, that our systems still bear its imprint, and that emancipation is not a finished chapter but an unfinished project. The shadows have not disappeared because the structures that supported slavery have not been dismantled. Power still seeks the cheapest labor, wealth still prioritizes profit over humanity, and ideology still cloaks exploitation in the language of necessity. Rome and America remind us that slavery thrives when societies accept domination as normal, when laws serve masters rather than the vulnerable, when human beings are reduced to property in practice if not in name. The modern world, for all its progress, has not fully escaped these traps. To hear the echoes today is to recognize the continuity of exploitation and to accept responsibility for confronting it. Slavery is not a relic of the past, but a feature of the present, as close as the products in our homes and the food on our tables. The challenge is not only to free those still in chains, but to reshape the systems that create chains anew. Otherwise, the lessons of Rome and America remain unheeded, and their shadows will stretch indefinitely into the future. The story of slavery has always been more than the story of bondage. It is also the story of endurance, of people who refuse to be reduced to things. That is true today as it was in the past. The echoes remind us not only of cruelty but of resistance, not only of oppression but of the human insistence on dignity. To listen to those echoes is to hear both the whip and the song, both the chain and the voice that rises above it, insisting that freedom, however denied, remains the deepest human inheritance.